Welcome back. This is the second part of the audio-visual version of my life story. In the first part, I had narrated my life up to academic stage. Here I shall tell about my service career from its beginning in December 1967 till mid-October 1995, the period I had served in the West Bengal Civil Service, Executive. The next part will comprise details of my service in the IAS, my post-retirement life, the various aspects of life, including service life as it impacted me, and a self-analysis. My service career had started in Beerhampori, Murshidabad. After the verification of the antecedents and the qualification, I was appointed to WBCS, Executive, and posted as a Deputy Magistrate and Deputy Collector, on probation, at Beerhampori, Murshidabad, on the result of the West Bengal Civil Services Examination, 1967. I was still due for my MSc examination. Initially, I had hesitated to accept the state civil service as a career. I took a few days to think. I had never been second to anyone that far in my academic career. In a youthful vein, I thought it might be difficult for me to fit in a service where I would mostly have to serve under the direct superintendence of all India service officers. My apprehension had come true to a certain extent in later times. There were conflicts and differences with my superiors in some of my assignments. In some such cases, where it became difficult to continue under persons of contrary mindset, I changed my place of work. In others, I stuck to my views without caring for the consequences that could follow. However, considering various aspects like salary element, the scope of work in diverse fields vis-a-vis available alternative avenues, at that time, I decided in favor of joining the service. Finally, on the 4th of December 1967, I had joined as Deputy Magistrate and Deputy Collector, Murshidabad, on probation. Thus started my service career, which spanned over more than 35 years, in the course of which I had the scope of working in different places under different circumstances and with different superiors. I had arrived at Beerhampori from Calcutta by train. It was the first time I had set foot in any district town in West Bengal. My entry to WBCS, Executive, was, as I have explained earlier in the first part of my life story, more by chance than by design. Had I not gone for the application forms for my brother, I would not have even known about it, what to speak of entering the service. First few months of service career, feelings and experiences. At Beerhampori, I was allotted a room in the local Doc Bungalow as temporary accommodation. Being a government rest place, I thought it would be good to stay. But, to my horror, I found, it was infested with rats and bugs and lacked even the minimum maintenance. I couldn't sleep for the first night. I became depressed. The high opinion I possessed about the premier civil service of the state, was shattered by this hard reality. It had so lowered my spirits that I had once thought of even quitting the service. However, finally, I did not leave the service, and fortunately, I did not also have to stay in the bungalow for long. An IAS probationer, Jugut Seth, since deceased, vacated a double-roomed government flat while leaving for a long-duration course of settlement training. Mr. Baroda, the then district magistrate of Murshidabad, allotted me the flat vacated by Mr. Sinha on my applying for it. Mr. Sharma, too, was from Assam. He had a soft corner for me for whatever reasons it might be. In my later service life, too, I felt this softness in his dealings towards me whenever I had worked under him, or I had approached him with any problem of mine. In this context, I recall here, one such later incident where he, as the deputy commissioner of a district, called me to know, if the leave recommended by my immediate superior officer, the SDO, in curtailment of what I had applied for, would serve my purpose. I was just a probationer then, posted in an outlying subdivision with only a couple of years of service in credit. District magistrates used to have a busy schedule and did not usually bother about the affairs of a state service probationer. Later, it was he again, at whose intervention I could get out of the god-forsaken place of Meekleganj after serving there for more than 4 years. I had got support from him in different matters at different times when in service, and he was around. After retirement as a secretary to the Government of India, Sri Sharma served in various other capacities, including being a member of the Central Administrative Tribunal, Calcutta Bench. Finally, he left West Bengal to live the retired life in his native place in Guwahati. He is one of those upright officers under whom I had served, and who had a distinct influence on my career as a civil servant. I shared the flat allotted to me with one of my colleagues, named Ganesh Chandra Chakrabarti. We stayed and messed together. An old widow cooked for us. She was a good cook. In those days, fresh fish and vegetables were available aplenty in Beerhampori at reasonable prices. We could, therefore, have varieties of good food. My salary at that time was 418.35 Indian rupees at the basic pay of 325 Indian rupees. After meeting all my expenses, including pocket money, I still could send 140 Indian rupees to 160 Indian rupees to my father, and that was a considerable amount in the 1960s. All India service officers, including IAS officers, used to draw a basic pay of 400 Indian rupees on entry to their service at that time. It was here that I had opened a bank account for the first time in my life. My father had never a bank account or money to keep in it. My brother, too, in all likelihood, did not have any bank account till he joined the service. Under the terms of service, a WBCS officer had to be on probation for 2 years. During this period, he had to complete the training successfully and pass the departmental examination in Hindi, law, accounts, and allied subjects. There was no training institute too for the state civil service officers in those days. Ours was an on-job training. Facilities for the institutional training have since been created for the state civil service officers. There is now a full-fledged administrative training institute, where WBCS officers joining on probation have to undergo in-house training for a part of their probationary period. WBCS officers are now required to undergo training on car driving also. On my joining at Beerhampori Collectorate, my training program was drawn up by the office superintendent with the approval of the district magistrate. The office superintendent was a strict man with personality. We, the probationers just out of college and yet to learn the nitty-gritty of administration, were very scared of him. We also had to submit our work diaries to the district magistrate through him. According to the training program, I had to remain attached to each section of the Collectorate, district magistrate's office, for several days, at a time, to be acquainted with the functioning of that section within the setup of the Collectorate. My first attachment was to the section called English Office. Sitting with the dealing assistant, I learned how to prepare and work on files, deal with communications received from different sources, prepare notes on such communications and place them before the higher authorities with suggestions for action. I learned here the fundamentals of the art of correspondence in a government office. Other sections I had attended as part of my training, while stationed here, were Judicial Munchikina dealing with judicial and quasi-judicial matters, Revenue Munchikina dealing with revenue matters, Amusement section dealing with permission and licenses for cinema and other sources of entertainment and imposition and realization of amusement taxes from such entertainment, Arms sections dealing with issue and renewal of arms licenses, etc. I still had many more sections and departments to go for training. As a trainee officer, I was also required to be conversant with the practice and procedure manual on the conduct of business in district offices and the departmental rules and regulations prescribed for related departments. Appear at MSC Examination, 1967 while in service. I have already mentioned while describing the academic life that I had skipped my final MSc examination at the end of my academic session in 1966. I thus remained due for next year's examination. The timetable for that examination was published now. I took leave for the period from March 25 to April 16, 1968 and appeared for the examination. In the examination hall, I was on the verge of breaking into tears when I found that answers to some of the questions were unknown to me. I was making mistakes and taking an unduly long time to write known answers due to nervousness. This had never happened to me in any of the previous examinations. Remorse filled me that I had wasted precious time otherwise than on study. I, however, passed the examination, but my result was nowhere near my standard. I got only a high second class. I shall never forget this ignominy and shall never recover from its pain. I can't forgive myself for straying away and not giving my whole at this last stage of my academic career. I felt it was the curse of the goddess of learning on me for doing what I should not have done. 1. Failing to do one's work at the right time, has to pay a heavy price in this way. I had earned it at the cost of everything I could accomplish that far in my academic career. In this context, I may mention, I could not collect my postgraduate certificate from the university first due to my long stay in far-off Mecklenburg and later due to my procrastination. Unfortunately, I had also lost the mark sheet at some unguarded moment. As far as I remember, the marks I had obtained was around 55%. Continuance of training at Beerhampori. After my Master of Science examination had been over, I returned to Beerhampori with an overwhelming sense of remorse. I had, however, to resume my training from the stage where I had left it. Under the guidance of the Treasury officer, Sri Surjaya Kumar Mundal, a good old man, I completed the prescribed term of continuous 6 weeks of Treasury training. In the Treasury, I learned the rules and the procedures for the management of government finance. Beerhampori was a non-banking treasury, where the cash transactions of the Treasury used to be done by the State Bank of India. For this, the bank and the Treasury had to maintain close liaisons. The bank sent scrolls, lists, of the government transactions to the Treasury every day at the end of the day, and the Treasury reconciled them with its accounts. The Treasury was required to send compiled accounts for the entire district to the Accountant General, West Bengal, at intervals and within the prescribed dates. Similarly, the State Bank had to send their compiled accounts to RBI. The accounts of the state and the central government in the state were reconciled at the levels of the Accountant General and the RBI. The district magistrate had gone through every minute detail of my Treasury training diary and had made comments of appreciation at the end. After I completed the Treasury training, I was detailed for subdivisional training under the SDO, Beerhampori. Here, I got myself acquainted with the functions of a subdivisional officer and his office. Sri Mrinal Kanthi Brahmachari, a senior member of our service, was the SDO, Beerhampori. We, the probationers, often visited his bungalow for atta, where his wife, an affable lady, entertained us with snacks and tea. Mrs. Brahmachari was also an exponent of Rabindra Sangeet. SDO's bungalow was adjacent to the wretched Doc Bungalow, where I had landed and stayed for a few days on my arrival at Beerhampori. In the course of my subdivisional training, I had done an inquest, the first and the last of its kind in my life, on a partially decomposed male dead body lying in a ditch by a paddy field. Marks of injury on the body, and the exact conditions of the limbs and the organs with the apparent cause of death, were recorded in my presence as required under the provisions of the inquest, and the body was sent for a post-mortem under police escort. At the Collectorate, the probationers had a separate room to sit. One common duty of the probationers was to sign the fair copies of letters issued in the name of the district magistrate from various sections of the Collectorate. Signature pads containing the fair copies of the letters to be issued duly compared by the dealing assistants with their approved drafts used to be sent to probationers' room. These fair copies were signed by one or the other of the probationers available at the relevant time. As far as I could surmise, the idea behind this system was to make the probationers acquainted with the day-to-day administration of the district besides keeping them engaged. By going through the fair copies before signing them and calling for original files, if necessary, the probationers could learn how various matters were dealt with in the Collectorate. Beerhampori bore a great legacy to the British Raj. There was a big square field, known as Barrack Square, around which were the offices including the Collectorate, and the senior officers' quarters. It was called Barrack Square as the buildings around it had been used as barracks for the British soldiers. At our times, there were 3 magnificent Gothic-type buildings almost side by that side of the square field which ran along the main road. 2 of these accommodated the Collectorate offices and the third the Textile College. On the vacant space between 2 of the buildings, there was the bus stand. On the opposite side across the field, there was the bungalow of the district magistrate, and by its side, an identical building accommodating the additional district magistrate, general, and the circuit house. Along the line of these buildings were the quarters of the superintendent of police and the divisional forest officer. On the other 2 sides of the square field, there were bungalows of other senior officers of the district administration. For other officers, there were a few government housing estates at a place called Lalding High not far from the Collectorate building. I used to live in one of these estates. Just behind the district magistrate's bungalow flowed the Bhagirathi. There were 2 government launches on the Bhagirathi at the disposal of the district magistrate for use during an emergency. There was a complaint of pilferage of fuel against the Sarangi, boatman, of one of these motorboats. The boatman was a government employee. The inquiry against him was entrusted to me. That had been the first departmental inquiry I had conducted. The charge was established. I had recommended a punishment of suspension of the delinquent's annual increment of salary for a year or 2. I had good and friendly senior colleagues in Beerhampori. Manojit Bandyopadhyay, Suhas Bhattacharya and Nirmalya Mukherjee were noteworthy amongst them. By tradition, senior colleagues in the service used to be addressed as Dada. Manojit Bandyopadhyay, whom we called Manojida, a 1959 batch WBCS, executive, officer, was a storehouse of jokes. He could tell a joke with a grim face making everybody laugh. He had ready jokes for every occasion. He was also a good conversationalist. He had a rich collection of anecdotes involving WBCS officers. The WBCS officers had to pass the departmental examination in Hindi. Most could not do it at one attempt. There were several anecdotes on answers given by them in oral examinations on Hindi. Some such answers would invite only laughter. Manojit often mimics some of these answers as jokes to us. Incidentally, in my departmental Hindi examination, I had come across in my passage for Hindi dictation, a dictum.
रुपया पैसा हाथ का मैल है, आते जाते रहते हैं.
Money is nothing but dust on the hand, it keeps on coming and going. I'll believe, there could be no better evaluation of money. This phraseology has remained embedded in my mind since then. Coming back to colleagues, Nirmalya Mukherjee was aged but apt in using slang. Sri P. N. Nuskar, a sub-magistrate at an advanced stage of his service career, was the senior deputy collector who, as per practice, looked after the matters concerning probationary officers. Amongst my probationer colleagues, those close to me were Ganesh Chandra Chakraborty and Rupendranath Bhattacharjee, both 1966 batch officers of West Bengal Junior Civil Service. Rupendranath Bhattacharjee was in the habit of using English words in the course of his conversation. We nicknamed him English Bhattacharjee. Much later, when I was the District Land and Land Reforms Officer and Additional District Magistrate, Howrah, government issued an order appointing me as a presenting officer with Nrupen as the inquiry officer in a departmental proceeding. As Nrupen was junior to me in the service and I, as a senior officer, could not report to him, I refused to comply with that order, and the government had to rescind the order to exclude me from its purview. At Beerhampori, I also met my old-time hostel mate Tisser Day of Hajra PG Hostel. He was working as an agronomist under District Agriculture Officer. I also got acquainted with some of Tisser's colleagues, of whom I still remember one named Svapun Raha. Svapun was an enjoyable company. Coming back to my training program, I may add that the program had an element of trial court training. We had to sit with the sessions judge and the magistrates of the first class to take down evidence in 3 sessions triable cases and 3 other cases, triable by the magistrate of the first class. Later, we had to annotate this evidence with relevant sections of the Indian Evidence Act and submit them to the government with certificates of court attendance from the concerned public prosecutor for the sessions cases and the magistrates concerned in magisterial cases. At Beerhampori, I, with my 2 other colleagues, completed this exercise for sessions cases. Later, at my next place of posting at Meekleganj, I completed the exercise for magisterial cases and submitted the records of all the 6 cases with required certificates to the Home, GA, Department as the Home, PAR, Department was called at that time. These were duly accepted by the government, and the acceptance was communicated to me during my tenure at Meekleganj. I had appeared for my first half-yearly departmental examination, too, from Beerhampori. Institutional training while at Beerhampori. Visit to Ajunta and Ellora. During my stay in Beerhampori, I had a short training course on civil defense at the National Civil Defense College, Nagpur. Post-1965 war with Pakistan, steps were taken to train civil service officers in civil defense matters. We were 7 participants from West Bengal in this training course. During the course, we made a short trip to Ajunta and Ellora. We could not, however, make it to the city of Aurangabad at a distance of about 100 km for want of time. Aurangabad too had many historical sites to see. After visiting Ajunta and Ellora on the same day, we boarded a bus from Ellora for Chalisgone, from where we took a night train to Nagpur. On the way from Ellora to Chalisgone, we passed through a hillock of black soil having plantations of bananas, called Singapore. What was interesting was that the plants were dwarf, and bunches of bananas hanging from them had almost touched the ground. The description of this trip is given in my travelogue Part A. That had been a very hectic trip, and besides being a cursory visit, it had left out many important places, in and around. Since then, I had been looking for an opportunity to revisit the area. The opportunity came decades later, in January 2015, when my school friend Asu, who now resides in South Wales in the UK, visited Calcutta. We made a joint trip to the district of Aurangabad and visited all its important historical places, including Ajunta and Ellora. Details of that tour and an electronic album of photographs of places we visited, and people we came across, are available in my travelogue Part B on my website. Breach of city rule while in Nagpur. Bicycles were the popular means of movement in the city of Nagpur in those days. Men and women both used cycles. Cycles were also available on hire. One afternoon, some of us were riding cycles procured locally on hire, carrying one co-trainee in the front and another on the back. Suddenly, a police constable stopped us and asked us to follow him to the city magistrate. We had violated the city rules by carrying 3 persons on a cycle. After much pleading and divulging our identity, we were let off with a warning from Constable Sahib. Beerhampori Officers Club. Beerhampori had a very good club for its officers. The club had a British legacy as pronounced in its style, amenities, and layout. It had provisions for all kinds of indoor games, like table tennis, billiard, carom etc., and outdoor games of badminton and lawn tennis, both hard courts. The badminton court was within an enclosure with high walls on all 4 sides to prevent air from disturbing the game. I occasionally played table tennis and badminton. There used to be housey games on Saturday evenings in which District Magistrate B.C. Sharma and his wife also participated at times. Mrs. Lakshmi Sharma, the charming wife of the District Magistrate, mostly won in the housey. I also played housey on a few occasions but don't remember to have ever won. About Beerhampori. I stayed at Beerhampori up to September 7, 1968. Beerhampori was a good place, full of life, and to my liking. I had picked up a good lot of friends and acquaintances here from amongst the officers. I never felt lonely so long as I was here, even though I was a bachelor at that time. Beerhampori had a lot of monkeys and donkeys. Young boys here, particularly those of the textile college, preferred to dress and behave like American cowboys. This made us call Beerhampori in a sarcastic vein, a place of monkeys, donkeys, and Yankees. Beerhampori, however, was a very cultured place enjoying the patronage in fine arts down from the days of Nawabs. Artists from various fields of arts had sowed the seeds of cultural heritage in this place. Local citizens maintained a calm lifestyle evoking a rich cultural environment. Every well-to-do parent sent their kids to at least one school of arts. Music, dancing, painting, acting was the most popular amongst these arts. Some of those old traditions are being followed even today. On Sunday mornings, one could see girls walking the streets with their musical instruments in hand, ostensibly to music/dance schools or to music/dance teachers. The place had been famous for brass utensils, called kagray utensils. It had also been known for elegant handicrafts in carpet making, jute and bamboo works, and miniature paintings. Murshidabad had also been famous for superior varieties of mangoes like Kohito or Begum Pasand, Dudbhog, Dilpasand, and sundry others. During my tenure at Beerhampori, the district magistrate, Murshidabad, had organized an exhibition of mangoes of Murshidabad at Beerhampori in the summer of 1968. That was the first of its kind here. All the varieties of mangoes growing in Murshidabad were on display with historical backgrounds. The special treatment most of these varieties required, before being ready for consumption, was also explained by those manning the exhibition. The exhibition was a great success and had attracted a large number of visitors from different places. Historical background of this district. The city of Murshidabad, to which this district owes its name, had been the center of power during the Nawab regime. The whole of Bengal used to be administered from here. After the defeat of Sirajudla at the Battle of Plessy, the capital of Bengal was shifted to Calcutta. Murshidabad, now called Lal Bagh, is at present a subdivision of this district. It had witnessed the activities of Nawabs of Bengal and has many historical exhibits in and around. It is here we find Hazarduri Palace, Kos Bagh, the house of Jugut Seth, Kutra Masjid, and the grave of Murtzafar. Hazarduri Palace, previously known as Barakutha, is located within the campus of Kila Nizamat. It was built in the 19th century by the architect Duncan MacLeod during the reign of Nawab Nazim Humayun of Bengal, Bir, and Orissa. It has 1,000 doors, of which 900 are false. There is a chandelier in the Durbar Hall, which is the second biggest in the world. Queen Victoria of Great Britain had presented this to Nawab. The palace has 114 rooms. There are also 2 pairs of mirrors in the museum in the palace. These are placed at 90 degrees to each other in a way that one cannot see one's face while others can see him. These were used by the Nawab to prevent perpetrators from harming him. These were so placed that the perpetrator could not see his face and thought only a mirror to be there, but the Nawab could see him and get him caught. The collection of antiquities in the palace includes various weapons, oil paintings of Dutch, French, and Italian artists, marble statues, metal objects, porcelain and stucco statues, farmans, rare books, old maps, manuscripts, land revenue records, palanquin, mostly belonging to the 18th and the 19th centuries. The Bakawala tope, lying on the campus of Kila Nizamat, was brought by Murshid Quli Khan. This cannon has been placed on a high altar, and its mouth has been sealed with an iron plate. It is said that when used, it made so loud a noise that it forced pregnant women to give birth to babies at that very time. Source: Wikipedia. Nawab Murshid Quli Khan lies buried under the staircase at the entrance of Kutra Masjid. This mosque, Kutra Masjid, is known not only as a great center of Islamic learning but also for the tomb of Murshid Quli Khan. The most striking feature of the mosque is its 2 large corner towers having holes for musketry. Jugut Seth and his families were rich businessmen and money-lenders in Murshidabad during the reign of Nawab Sirajudla. He came of a Marwari Jain family of the place. As we know from history, he joined Amachand and Murtzafar in the conspiracy against Sirajudla. His house still stands there at Lal Bagh as a symbol of the history of treachery. Jafarganj Cemetery was built by Mir Jafar in an area of 3.51 acres within an enclosure of waved walls. It was about half a mile north of the Nizamat Fort campus and inside the campus of what is known as Namak Hazarduri. It hosts the graves of the later Nawabs of Bengal of the Nafahi dynasty, starting with Mir Jafar. The district town of Beerhampori was established at a distance of 13 km from Murshidabad as a municipality in 1869. In early July 1968, I received my first order of transfer appointing me as the deputy magistrate and deputy collector, on probation, in the district of Cooch Behar. I was posted to the Meekleganj subdivision of that district with the trial powers of a magistrate of the third class. Meekleganj was known as a lonely and dull place. Officers would go all the way to avoid posting there. My additional district magistrate at Beerhampori, Mr. Unish Majumdar, who later became Chief Secretary to the government of West Bengal, had asked me if I were keen to move to the new place. I could have got my orders cancelled with his help, as did one of my colleagues earlier for his posting in a development block. But I felt it was prudent to serve in the interior places at the early stage of my service career. The fearlessness I had acquired by then might also have prompted me to accept the challenge. This hasty and impulsive decision had a far-reaching effect on my later life and character. I now feel I made a grave mistake by not asking for the cancellation of my posting there. Anyway, I joined my new post on September 16, 1968. I had arrived with a small hold-all of my bedding materials and a steel trunk containing some clothes, a few books, and some essential documents. I was accommodated in the local Doc Bungalow. This Doc Bungalow was worse than the one I had stayed in on my arrival at Beerhampori. Far from being a bungalow, it was hardly a place to live in. The nomenclature bungalow itself was a misnomer here. Later, during my stay here, we had nicknamed it Bhoot Bungalow. Since, however, I had learned by now the way the government functioned, the reaction this time was not as sharp as it was in Beerhampori. The wretched condition of the two successive Doc Bungalows I came across at the dawn of my service career created an adverse notion in me about these places for night halts. My said notion changed later when I saw the Doc Bungalows in the district towns of Cooch Behar, Burdwan, and elsewhere. Bungalows there were relatively of better condition. But, then I was no longer required to stay in Doc Bungalow during my tours to the district headquarters. I used to stay in the circuit house barring one or two occasions when I had stayed in Cooch Behar Doc Bungalow. Speaking of the so-called Doc Bungalow of Meekleganj, it was a pucca structure of two small single rooms and a little bigger one of a sort of drawing-cum-dining space in between, the latter provided with an oval-shaped table and a few chairs. The roof was of corrugated iron sheets. Each of the single rooms had a single bed, a small table fitted with a mirror, and a chair. There was a small bathroom attached to each. Each bathroom had a wooden commode from which the sweeper had to clear the night soil physically. There was no electricity. For water, there was a ring well within the compound from which menials used to lift and supply water for use in the bathroom. The compound was spacious and there was a separate tin shed within it for cooking for the occupiers of this bungalow. There were a palm tree, a teak tree, and several other trees of different species within the compound of the bungalow, all of which were still there when I had revisited the place after 43 years of my leaving. One room of the bungalow remained vacant most of the time, and, practically, I was the lone occupier like the lone palm tree of its species in the compound. In the absence of any suitable alternative accommodation, I had to bear with this one for more than 2 years. Possibly my childhood background had helped me in doing so. From its current version, one can't perceive what this bungalow had been in its older days when I had stayed here. I do not, unfortunately, have any photographs of the bungalow of those days to show the differences. Surprisingly, there had been no change in the other structures within the compound since the days I had stayed here, except what was caused by the wear and tear of time. Even the lone palm tree of my time still stands there. I had found a striking contrast between the renovated Doc Bungalow and these left-out portions during my visit to the place in December 2015. The look of these structures may give an idea of the Doc Bungalow of older days. How I felt about my place of stay. I have suffered a lot due to the absence of the bare necessities of modern life in this rural town where I had to live for more than 4 years. It used to give rise to a feeling of dismay and distress in my mind. Since my late teens, I had not lived in such a poor environment. The bungalow where I had to stay, too, was far below a standard living accommodation. Notwithstanding all its deficiencies, as a place to live in, I had enjoyed some nocturnal charms while living in this bungalow. It would arouse in me a poetic and romantic feeling otherwise lying dormant. Very often, in the darkness of the night, I used to be, as it were, amid nature. On new moon nights, flocks of fireflies visited me and gave me company while flying around in the room, emitting their lights here and there. During the full moon, I enjoyed the cool moonlight reaching through the window. Lying on the bed bathed in mystic moonlight, I imbibed the pleasure of viewing the full moon in the distant sky while my mind traveled, as if, to a dreamland. On the monsoon nights, I used to be woken up by the thunder and the flash of lightning. I lay in silence, listening to the sweet melody of the rains, showering the iron roof. The chirping of the crickets came from a distance while thunders roared in the sky from time to time. At the dead of the night, lying all alone on my bed, I enjoyed this romantic atmosphere. In this loneliness of night, I often yearned for the company of someone special. During my visit to the place in 2015, I found that the bungalow had undergone a total renovation. One front veranda had been added, a pair of standard-size windows fixed on 2 sides of a central door provided for entering the building from the veranda. During my days, there had been only one small window at the front in each of the rooms on either side of the central door. These have since been made bigger and of standard size. 2 separate doors have also been provided for entry from the veranda to the individual rooms on 2 sides of the central door. In older days, the entrance to the individual room was only from the dining room. The size of the individual room had also apparently increased. I did not have a view inside. The bungalow today is also provided with AC and has modern bathrooms and toilets attached to bedrooms. In a word, the bungalow has now been made habitable as opposed to its 1960s and 70s versions. There was, however, no change in other structures within the premises of the bungalow as I have stated before. About officers other than the SDO in Mecklenburg SDO's office. Save a bungalow for the SDO, there was only one government quarter here meant for the officer, who was next to the subdivisional officer in seniority, called the second officer in the administrative hierarchy. When I came here, that quarter was in the occupation of my senior colleague Balachandra Chakrabarti. Bala was staying there with his newly married wife. Soon Bala and his wife Chabi became my good friends. When I had joined SDO's office at Mecklenburg, Bala had been the only other officer posted there. He was a 1966 batch WBCS, executive, officer. Bala often invited me to lunch or dinner. His wife was not very apt to cook those days. He had a cook dessous, who could cook well and was a trainer for the lady. My friendship with Bala lasts till today. We live in the same cooperative building we, with a few other colleagues, had built, in Salt Lake, Calcutta. Bala was the prime mover in my joining this housing cooperative society. Unfortunately, he lost his wife a few years back. He has an unmarried son who lives with him. In September-October 1970 Bala had left Mecklenburg on transfer. Before Bala had left Mecklenburg, Sri Amal Kisku, another WBCS officer, had joined, as his substitute. Sri Kisku belonged to the Santhal community and was married. He stayed in a rented accommodation a little off from the office complex. He was the 3rd officer. True to his tribe, Kisku was a simple person. Once, he had his leg fractured in an accident while cycling to the office. He remained bedridden with a plastered leg for a few weeks. He was allowed to work from home at that time. 2nd officer's official residence and the days of my stay there. In November 1970, after Bala had left on transfer, I moved to the quarter vacated by him. I was then the second officer in seniority. Behind my new residence was the quarter of the officer in charge, Meekleganj PS, and to the north that of the Circle Inspector of Police, Meekleganj. To the south of it were the quarters of the sub-jail staff. My residence had barbed wire fencing all around it with a front and a rear gate. Between my quarters and those of the jail staff stood 3 gigantic old teak trees, the stem of each being a few meters in circumference. Behind these giant trees, there were some banana plants within the compound of my quarters. There was a narrow path between the boundary of my quarters and that of jail warders' quarters running by the side of the teak trees. Someone, spoken of later in this chapter, from a nearby house being fascinated by me, trod on this pathway pre-dawn and post-dawn hours to catch my attention when I roamed within the compound of my quarters in the early hours. The family she belonged to had arrived after I had shifted to this quarter. I lived alone in this moderately big bungalow for a good part, 1 year and 4 months, of my tenure in Meekleganj. I had, however, accommodated Satish Taneja, the local sub-registrar, in my quarters, for some time to beat the boredom and loneliness. After marriage, I had lived in this house for about 8 months before I left Meekleganj on transfer. I had a local boy named Amasu to cook for me and to do other odd jobs during my bachelor days here. He was not a good cook, but I somehow managed with him. I was, after all, not fussy in food matters. Cooking used to be done in a coal oven. LPG had not arrived. SDO's office and other offices in its premises. SDO's office spread over several small pucca buildings with the courtroom and the banking treasury annexed to one of those buildings. This building housing the court, the treasury, and the officers' chambers was very old and not fit for electrical connection. Hand-drawn punkas were provided in this building for summertime use. These punkas used to be drawn by menials called punka pullers who were seasonal workers employed during summer. There was another adjacent building accommodating the Munsif Court and the sub-registry office in the SDO's office premises. The young sub-registrar, by the natural law of loneliness, soon became my friend. The Munsif Court was a circuit court and used to function on specified days in a month. The Munsif did not stay at Meekleganj, he used to come on court days. Employees of SDO's office. There were a number of honest and dutiful employees in the office of the SDO, Meekleganj. At the head of them was the head clerk Malina Mohan Sarkar. Sarkar was a workaholic. He could be seen working in the office much before the office sat, and long after the office broke. In emergent situations, like floods and elections, he would hardly leave office, and at times, even forego his food and daily necessities. His efficiency, sincerity, and reliability were beyond question. The then subdivisional Nazir Sri Bijoy Chakraborty and the clerk in charge of relief section Debabrata, nicknamed Putu, Dutta were also thoroughly honest, dutiful, and efficient. SDOs, I had worked with in Meekleganj. At Meekleganj, I worked with 4 SDOs, all being senior members of our service. Badal Chandra Chaudhary was the incumbent SDO when I joined. He was a colorful personality. He preferred speaking in English and calling himself Badal C. Chowdhury. He lived alone in his bungalow while his wife lived elsewhere and was probably engaged in some other profession. He was a connoisseur of poetry and a good table talker. He, it was said, had a weakness for women. I did not work with him for long. An unhappy incident, which I shall describe later, required him to leave the place all of a sudden. After Badal Chaudhary came Siddhartha Mitra, a 1959 batch WBCS officer. Mr. Mitra grudged, recommending leave for his subordinate officers. He would go on leave, leaving the subdivision in the care of 2 probationers viz., Balachandra Chakrabarty and me. But when Bala or I needed leave, he would always ask for a substitute from the Deputy Commissioner, DC. Even then, he would first try to get the leave postponed citing various reasons and if it did not succeed, try to get it curtailed. I remember, He had sent me a communication for an early resumption of duty when I had gone on leave to attend the last rites of my father at my brother's place at Silchar, even though he was having a substitute working in my place. I did not, however, give any importance to his letter. Mr. Mitra had once recommended a curtailment of the leave I had prayed for to attend my brother's marriage. I have already narrated subsequent developments in that matter while telling about my first district magistrate Sri B.C. Sharma, on the page of my first posting. I believe Sri Mitra was somewhat shaky in running the administration without his regular team of officers. After Mr. Mitra, came Salil Ranjan Bhaumik, a 1960 batch WBCS officer. Sri Bhaumik was a nice man. His wife, whom we called Manjari Bowdy, was a good singer. He had a son, Raja. His mother also stayed with him. I learned a great deal from him about the procedure for the conduct of an election. He used to say, conduct of an election is like giving a daughter in marriage. Everything should be flawless at every stage. I had got married during the tenure of Sri Bhaumik at Meekleganj. Mrs. Bhaumik, our Manjari Bowdy, had played an active role in my marriage reception. Sri Bhaumik's mother also liked my wife. At the concluding stage of my tenure here, came Deepankar Ganguly, a 1962 batch WBCS officer, since deceased as of 2020, who was my fourth and the last SDO. Events of my life and experiences I gathered while posted at Meekleganj. As I have already said, I had joined my post at Meekleganj on the 16th of September 1968. I had stayed there till December 18, 1972, a period of more than 4 years. There were many important events in my personal and official life during this period. I would recapitulate some of these in chronological order in the following paragraphs, which would evoke both pleasure and pain in me. A. Devastating North Bengal floods, 1968. Shortly after I had joined Meekleganj, I faced the havoc of the devastating flood of North Bengal. The year was 1968. I had gone to Silchar for the puja holidays to see my parents, who were staying with my brother there. Incidentally, this had turned out to be my last meeting with my father. Anyway, after the pujas, I started on my return journey to my workplace by train on October 5, 1968. I had my tickets booked up to New Mainaguri, the nearest railway station to my workplace. But I could move only up to Guwahati, as Guwahati used to be called in those days. Train services west of Guwahati remained suspended due to the floods. I had come to know by the time I reached Guwahati that there were heavy floods in that part of West Bengal, too, where I had been posted. I had two options, to return home and send a message to the DM and the SDO informing them of the inaccessibility to my place of work and applying for leave, and, 2, to take up a risky and uncertain journey by road in an attempt to reach my place of work. I decided on the latter, as I felt it was my duty as a civil servant to be at my post at that juncture. I, therefore, boarded a bus for Dhubri, which bordered the district of Cooch Behar in West Bengal, and from where I could reach my workplace by road. I reached Dhubri but could not go beyond and had to halt for the night in Dhubri. The river Pagladhara had submerged a bridge connecting Dhubri to Baksarhat of Jafarganj subdivision in Cooch Behar district. Water was swirling over the bridge, and it was impossible to cross over. The next morning, as the water receded, I boarded a bus to Baksarhat from where I took another bus to reach Cooch Behar. At Cooch Behar, I reported to the Deputy Commissioner and stayed for the night there as advised. Bhaskar Ghosh was DC. There was no transport available for Meekleganj. The vehicle, a jeep, of SDO, Meekleganj, had come for repairs to Cooch Behar before the floods and was ready for return after the repairs. The morning after arriving in Cooch Behar, I started for Meekleganj by that repaired vehicle along with some of the staff members of the SDO's office, who were stranded at Cooch Behar due to floods. The roads were in deplorable condition with breaches and large potholes at places. The PWD had made diversions at points where the road had breached and was still at work at different points as we found in the course of our journey. There were the rotten carcasses of domestic animals lying on the roads and the flanks here and there. Carcasses were also seen being carried away by flooded roadside drains. The stench of the carcasses had pervaded the air. A large number of flood-ravaged and collapsed houses were seen around. It was a devastating scene. After passing through such bleak scenes in a hazardous journey, I finally reached the destination late afternoon with the vehicle, which was the first vehicle to enter Mcleganj after the floods. The vehicle could not proceed up to the office premises as a culvert had breached on the way. I met our SDO Badal Chaudhary on the way at a point near the locality called Singhpara. Mr. Chaudhary was wearing an improvised towel, gamsha, in which he had crossed the channel at the collapsed culvert site. He was having some discussions with the local people. He was happy at my return and the return of the vehicle. After my return, I became busy with relief work. Shortly thereafter, I was sent to Haldibari, the other block of the subdivision, to help the BDO in flood relief work there. A note: while leaving for the Puja holidays, I had left my certificates and mark sheets of the examinations I had passed in my academic life, in a steel trunk in the Doc Bungalow, where I had put up on joining my post here. During the flood, water had flowed into the Doc Bungalow, seeped into my trunk, and had badly damaged some of these important documents. Some of the books I had received as prizes for academic excellence during my school days were also damaged. When I was at Haldibari, an unhappy incident occurred at Mcleganj, which made the incumbent SDO leave the place all of a sudden. An Air Force plane had been dropping relief materials to the marooned people in the char areas, vegetative islands, of the river Teesta under Mcleganj PS. During the operation, 2 packets of such materials somehow fell on the nearby school ground at Mcleganj, hitting and killing 2 persons amongst the people assembled there. Mr. Bhaskar Ghosh DC, Kuch Beer, and Mr. Badal Chaudhary, SDO had been close by. The mob attacked the SDO, who was seriously injured and had to be airlifted immediately for proper treatment. Mr. Chaudhary was later posted elsewhere. The attack on Mr. Chaudhary was apparently engineered by a local resident, who might have had some personal grievance against him. The SP, Kuch Beer, was also manhandled in that incident in trying to save the SDO. The SDO had no part in the accidental airdropping of the packets. Higher officials of the district administration, including the DC and the SP, were present at the spot. It betrays reasons as to why SDO would be selectively attacked unless there was something that does not meet the eye. For the next couple of months, we remained busy with the relief and rehabilitation of the flood victims and the visits of higher officials. The worst affected district in the 1968 floods of North Bengal was, however, Jalpaiguri, particularly the nearby Jalpaiguri town. Many human lives were lost, and a large number of domestic animals had died there. This flood was caused due to the Teesta embankment at a place called Domahoni in Jalpaiguri district, giving way under the pressure of water following a heavy discharge from the upper region in Teesta Bazaar. Earlier, there were incessant rains in the upper region of the Teesta Bazaar, a place in the Darjeeling Hills on the way to Kalimpong, 4 days together. It was after this devastating flood that the flood warning system was introduced in North Bengal on the recommendation of a committee headed by K.K. Sen, ICS. Mr. Sen had also visited Mcleganj for that purpose. If my memory fails me not, Mrs. Indira Gandhi, the Prime Minister of India, had visited Mcleganj sometime after the floods of 1968. Possibly that was the only occasion of a Prime Minister visiting this small town of Mcleganj. Mr. Bhaskar Ghosh, the then DC, Kuch Beer, had driven the jeep by which Mrs. Gandhi had travelled inside Mcleganj. Security agencies like SPG were not there in those days to guard the Prime Minister. Mrs. Gandhi had only her personal security officer with her, besides the security provided by the state police. B. Elections to WB Assembly, 1969 and 1971. In early 1969, there was a midterm election to the West Bengal Legislative Assembly. This was my first opportunity to be actively associated with the conduct of an election and to have experience in that matter. Being in the subdivision, I had the scope of learning matters in greater detail. It was by the result of this election that the Second United Front government headed by Ajunta Mukherjee with Jyoti Basu as Deputy Chief Minister, came to power in West Bengal. The ministry was sworn in on February 25, 1969 and lasted for a mere 13 months. In March 1971, there was another midterm election of the West Bengal Legislative Assembly, the second in 2 years. This was necessitated by the resignation of Ajunta Mukherjee as the chief minister following his protest movement against his own government on the deterioration of law and order. The election was held under the president's rule, and Dharamvira was the governor during that election. This was the second time I got associated with the conduct of elections in the Mekhliganj subdivision. I had already gained experience during the election of 1969, and this time it enriched my experience. I was deputed to Haldibarri block to act as election in charge for that area in my capacity as assistant returning officer. At that time, Jalpaiguri was a disturbed district due to the Naxal movement. To access Haldibarri, which formed a part of our subdivision, one had to pass through a long stretch of the Jalpaiguri district. In view of the Naxal threat, apart from security at polling booths, special security arrangements had to be made for transporting polled ballot boxes from Haldibarri for counting of votes to take place at the subdivisional headquarters of Mekhliganj at a distance of about 75 km. It required elaborate planning at the election reception center at Haldibarri for the safekeeping of polled ballot boxes, before these were ready for dispatch to the subdivisional headquarters. We also had to seek the assistance of the army for safe transportation of polled ballot boxes. By arrangements, an army contingent trailed the convoy of the paramilitary forces and the district police escorting the polled ballot boxes. I, as in charge of election for the Haldibarri PS area, and Mr. Nirupamandal, the BDO Haldibarri, were in the convoy. We started from Haldibarri late at night and reached Mekhliganj without any incident the early next morning. The Election Commission of India had made some changes in the counting process in that election, 1971. Mixing of polled ballot papers of all the polling stations under a constituency prior to candidate-wise actual counting was introduced for the first time. The counting was delayed due to this procedural change. We had to work overnight to complete the counting of votes and declare the result. The process made it difficult for the political parties to identify areas that had voted for or against them. C. Father's death, August 15, 1969. I lost my father while I was posted here. It was the 16th of August 1969, I received a telegraphic message from my brother saying that the father had expired the previous day. The news came to me like a bolt from the blue. My parents had been staying with my brother in Silchar at that time. I left for home at once on receipt of the news but couldn't see the body, as it was consigned to flames, by the time I could reach the place. It took me 2 days to reach Silchar. Those days, there was no arrangement for embalming the dead bodies at Silchar. I observed all rituals with my elder brother, attended the last rites, Srad, and returned to my place of work. The last memory of my father was of 1968 autumn when I had visited him during the puja holidays. He had come out of the bamboo fencing of our house to see me off as I started for my place of work, and I had bowed down to his feet to seek his blessings. That was the last time ever I had seen my father alive. That scene remains etched in my mind. I had great love, respect, and concern for my father. I did never act contrary to his advice nor had ever protested in his face. In my childhood, when he went out for some work, I could not be at rest till he returned. After he had established the printing press, I used to be with him to help him in his work except for the time I would be in school or on studies. Possibly it was due to all this that I had not been swept away but could rise with head high in the face of all odds, financial and psychological. 4. There goes a tenet in Sanskrit.
Pita dharma, pita karma, pita hi paramam tapa. Pitori Pritimapanne Rionte Sarvadevata.
Love and respect for the parents are on the wane in modern society. Old parents are often neglected and ill-treated. They are even assaulted or thrown out of the house. We come across such reports in the media from time to time. There are instances where ill-fated parents had to move the court of law to recover their property from their children, who had driven them out. These indicate an awful degradation of society and a total absence of moral education to the present generation. I firmly believe such people, dishonoring or causing harm to their parents, get paid back for their acts in some form or other, whether they know it or not. Floods at Meekleganj, 1970. In early August 1970, there was again a severe flood affecting more or less the whole of Meekleganj subdivision. I was again sent to Haldibari to assist the BDO, as in charge of relief and rehabilitation for the flood victims. Requisition of Army. As the situation demanded, I requisitioned the Army help in boats and personnel for relief and rescue operations. This was on the 9th of August, 1970. The Army official to whom I had handed over the requisition was at that time in Haldibari surveying the area with his team. Here, I had acted beyond my powers. I would be in a soup if anything went wrong. But I had to do it to save life and property. In the districts, it was only the deputy commissioner or the district magistrate who had the authority to requisition the Army. My deputy commissioner was more than 200 km away, and it was an emergency. I had, however, kept the DC informed. The DC had later formally confirmed the requisition to the Army authorities concerned, ex post facto. This incident is recalled to highlight that civil servants, if needed, have to give precedence to the safety and security of life and property over rules and regulations, in the public interest. This reminds me of a question put to me in my interview for entry to the service. I was asked, if there were a severe flood requiring immediate relief to be given to the people or repair of the breaches in the embankments to be done, whether I should wait for the completion of tender formalities as per the government rules, for procurement of materials or undertaking of repair work. My reply was that the safety of life and property should have an overriding priority. D. 2. Army deployment and associated problem. I must record here that the major, who had led the Army contingent I had requisitioned, was a good man. He was one Major Gunputty. I found in him a sincere, earnest, and helpful Army officer. Deployment of the Army, however, brought with it the associated problems. One morning, the local MLA Amar Roy Pradhan of the forward block rang me up and demanded immediate replacement of the Army contingent. An Army Jawan had molested a local woman the previous evening. I contacted Major Gunputty, who informed me that he had already been working on it and expected to find out and punish the culprit by the evening. I informed the MLA of the position, adding my views that replacing the contingent as demanded by him would be no guarantee against the recurrence of such incidents. Besides, the Major had already initiated action, and the punishment, when awarded to the culprit on identification, would deter others in the contingent from such acts. In the evening, Major Gunputty informed me that the culprit had been identified and sent back to their headquarters to face penal action. The matter rested there. Demonstration/deputation on demand for relief. At that time, there used to be demonstrations led by local political leaders at the BDO's office, Haldibari, to press for relief materials for their followers. These were parts of their political program. On a couple of occasions, Major Gunputty happened to be there in the office while on a visit to his area of operation. He wondered why I was not taking action against the troublemongers. Later, I told him that though an element of politics was involved in the matter, the demonstrators were our people and in distress. We had to listen to them and wait up to a point before we took any action to quell them. Soon there occurred an incident forcing me to take action against the demonstrators. On September 3, 1970, people from some areas, along with their panchayat representatives, assembled in front of the BDO's office and started pressing for relief for those people, whose names had been duly struck off the eligibility list for relief distribution after a field survey. These people had objections to the contents of the survey report. This is a normal phenomenon often seen during flood relief operations. Negotiations were conducted with the local representatives, and some of their demands were acceded to. The other demands put forward by the local representatives were also under consideration when at around 6 p.m., the crowd outside BDO's office suddenly became restive and resorted to violence. BDO's office was attacked, and furniture was broken. Due to brick baiting, a constable of the police picket, posted in the office, received bleeding injuries. At that point, I declared the assembly unlawful in my capacity as an executive magistrate and asked the OC of the PS present there to disperse the mob. There was a mild lathy charge, and the mob dispersed. I got full support from the Deputy Commissioner. There was no further deputation or demonstration at BDO's office after this incident as long as I stayed there. Bangladeshi immigrants problem, 1971. Then, there was the Bangladesh immigrant problem of 1971. This mostly affected the Haldibari block of our subdivision. Due to the incoming stream of immigrants, the population of the Haldibari PS area started swelling and became almost double within a short period. These refugees spread all over the PS area and took shelter wherever they found any vacant space. It caused severe problems of accommodation, food, clothing, and public health. For the first few days, people came in large numbers. There was no prior intimation of people coming in such huge numbers, and there was no preparation for receiving them. It took us some time to arrange provisions. A good section of these people had, therefore, to stay in the open for a few days, after all the schools and other public buildings were occupied. In the absence of alternative arrangements, they defecated in the open, causing a health hazard. Occasional rains had further aggravated the problem. It was a tremendous task for the administration to keep the situation under control. We had the cooperation of all concerned authorities in this regard. Setting up of temporary camps for refugees. To resolve the problem, temporary structures were built, on available vested lands, on an emergency footing. Additional employees for the maintenance of camps in these structures were appointed. Guards were placed for the security of the camps. The influx of immigrants in Haldibari being large, all of them could not be accommodated in that PS area alone. A sizable portion of it was dispersed to other subdivisions of Cooch Behar district, as per the plan of dispersal, drawn up by the Deputy Commissioner. The entire operation for the reception and the settlement of Bangladeshi refugees was monitored by the Deputy Commissioner himself. Sri Barodacharan Sharma was the DC of Cooch Behar at that time. As far as my memory goes, he was commended by the government for his meritorious services in successfully managing the Bangladeshi refugee problem in the Cooch Behar district. Few other district magistrates/deputy commissioners of the border districts, too, were commended similarly. There were some non-Bengali immigrants, too, who had infiltrated along with others. A separate camp was set up for them. It was initially set up at a place called Jamalda. Later, it was shifted near the BDO's office, on the bank of the river Dharala, in Chnagrabandha, Meekliganj. The camp was kept properly guarded. My marriage, 1972. Immediately following my passing of the matriculation examination, my parents started receiving proposals for my marriage from the girls' sides. I was then a couple of years ahead of my mid-teens. I had declined all those proposals. Once, I had even skipped an invitation for lunch where there was a plan to present before me a girl for marriage. It was proposed that in the event of my marrying the girl, I would get 50,000 Indian rupees or a motorbike, as a dowry. The proposal was disdainful for me and would hurt my principal. To avoid all these embarrassments, I had turned down the invitation. This event had occurred in 1969 when I was already employed and had been earning 418 Indian rupees per month as a Class 1 officer in the government of West Bengal. I was thus not prepared for marriage even after I had got into service. A couple of years later, I was, however, forced to make a hasty decision to marry to fight the loneliness and dullness of the place I had been living in for a long time on account of employment. Accordingly, I got married here on the 6th of March 1972. I myself had chosen a local girl, named Ajunta Singh as my wife. The marriage, however, did not have any history of courtship behind it, though it was an intercaste marriage. About my wife. My wife had some exceptionally good qualities which I have mentioned in the chapters on my postings in Rajbhawan and Pirep. But at the same time, she had some serious deficiencies. She was too soft by nature and was overindulgent towards the children without knowing what harm it could cause them. She could not be hard on the children even when that was necessary to enable them to differentiate between evil and virtue. She did not possibly have the occasion to learn the wise saying, "Spare the rod and spoil the child," in a rhetoric sense. She would not listen to anyone where the children were concerned. Sometimes in 2011, my wife was diagnosed with cancer and was treated to her full recovery. She is still under medical care, being in the 10th year, as of 2021, after recovery from cancer. Cancer has, however, damaged some of her mental faculties, aggravating her irritability and inducing forgetfulness to quite some extent. In those months of her cancer treatment, I had deployed myself in my entirety to get her well and back to health. Those were nightmarish days for me. I had to undergo tremendous physical strain and mental agony. But I stood like a rock and got it past. The central government health scheme had helped me financially a lot. I thanked my stars that I had finally joined the All India service, even though belatedly. As ill luck could have it, my wife has been recently, January 2022, diagnosed with progressive disease dementia. I don't know where this disease will lead us to, though at my end I am trying my best to keep it contained at the stage at which it is now. Court experience. Cattle thefts and illegal immigration were frequent in the border areas of Meekleganj in those days. As a magistrate with third-class power, I tried these petty cases and similar other offences. Thus, I had gained a first-hand experience of holding courts. My trial power lapsed with the separation of the judiciary from the executive, which took place in the Cooch Behar district in the early 1970s. After the separation, I exercised the powers of an executive magistrate of the first class. Car driving lesson. It is also here that I had learned car driving. The government drivers deputed with vehicles for relief and rehabilitation work for the refugees from Bangladesh helped me much in this. I had always been a devoted learner. I soon became adept and confident in driving. I used to drive the vehicle, with the driver sitting by, while on tour to distant places like Hazarduri or Cooch Behar. I must admit that it was not legal. Anyway, I gained driving experience on the national highways in the process. I, however, did not have a driving license, though I could have easily gotten it in the position I had held. Fortunately for me, I did not also cause any accident, for which I could have been prosecuted for driving without a license. Girl falls in love. A girl fell in love with me when I was working here. She became worried about me for my unlicensed driving and sent me a letter signed as well-wisher requesting me not to drive. The letter was signed as a well-wisher. That was her first sign of showing love for me without exposing herself. But it did not take me long to identify her. I diagnosed the style of writing as of woman. Considering this with some other later demeanor of the girl, I could surmise who the writer was. She was a neighborhood girl who lived opposite my official quarters, was fair and beautiful though a little short in stature. I can't say I was not touched by the manifestation of her concern for me. But I preferred to keep quiet. I could not, however, ignore the matter altogether. Her appeal used to ring in my ears when I drove the car and made me doubly careful. Later, too, the girl gave enough indication of her love and concern for me in different other ways. If I was not grossly mistaken, it was she again who had brought the news of a conspiracy hatched by the jail warders to attack me in the sub-jail, details under jail administration, to the knowledge of the SDO through her father. From her airs and manners, too, I could read she had been intensely in love with me and longed to have a ride together. I had not spoken to her save and except on one occasion, and then too, only in a couple of words. She had later made an opportunity out of what I had said on that occasion to open her heart to me. She had said, "For a long time, I have been trying to get closer to you." I had nothing to say in reply. My heart had not responded to her call. Maybe, she could have made a good wife, but I had already decided to marry elsewhere. The girl, it seemed, had carried her love for me in her heart even when she left the place we had been staying in. For, she had sent her father to inquire about me at my new place of posting, where I had joined a few months after she and her family had left our old place. Her father had no business to meet me unless he was prevailed upon by his daughter to do so. The gentleman met me and left after tacitly ascertaining my marital status. That was the last I had heard of her. I have never come across any woman so persistent in love for someone of her choice. That visit by her father made me realize that she still had her love for me. Time and distance could not kill it. I felt hurt. Though I had not done anything on my part to arouse her feelings, I feel sad at times for being a cause of her sorrow and disappointment. Maybe she was enamored of me and had developed a deep and sincere love for me, and that might, again, be an occasion where I had earned genuine love of a woman. But I did not get any signal from my heart to fall for it. She, though, had tried her most to have me in her life. Non-banking treasury experience. Mecklenburgh was one of the few sub-treasuries in West Bengal, which transacted cash business in those days. It was, indeed, a unique experience to work in the treasury there. It helped me understand how the treasuries conducted cash business for the government in the older days, before the Reserve Bank of India in Calcutta, and the State Bank of India in the districts, took it over. We had large quantities of old obsolete coins, besides currency notes and stamps of various denominations in court fees, non-judicial and postal stamps in the Treasury strong room with the double lock system. Question papers for the public examinations also used to be kept in the custody of the Treasury. Annual verification of accounts of the treasuries was a statutory requirement for the district magistrates/deputy commissioners. During such verification, all the stocks of stamps and the currency, including this large number of old coins, had to be verified with the balance in the registers. The verification of these old coins was made by weights according to the procedure laid down in the West Bengal Treasury rules. Cash for the treasury used to be replenished by bringing currency from the State Bank of India, Kuch Beer, on a requisition sent via the district treasury. There used to be an additional post titled Poddar for cash handling in such treasuries. Property registration. I had also gained experience in the registration of properties by officiating as sub-registrar in the absence of the regular sub-registrar on leave or otherwise. Experience in jail administration. On behalf of the SDO as the superintendent of the sub-jail, I also used to look after the day-to-day administration of the sub-jail. I was aware of a general complaint of substandard food materials supplied in various jails. I visited the sub-jail at times, particularly when the contractors brought in the materials for daily consumption in the sub-jail, to check the standard of supply. I had also warned a supplier for default in the quality of materials supplied. Some jail staffs, who were in league with the contractor, were unhappy at this and were conspiring to attack me during my visit. Thanks to a certain well-wisher, I had received the information in advance. This part of the job helped me to be acquainted with the administration of jails in the state. Confirmation in service. Finally, I had fulfilled all the requirements for my confirmation in service while at Mecklenburgh. I had also received orders of my confirmation in the service there itself. Life at Mecklenburgh. As for Mecklenburgh, it is a small subdivisional town of Kuch Beer on the bank of River Teesta, having borders with East Pakistan, now Bangladesh. Mecklenburgh subdivision comprised two police stations, Mecklenburgh and Hazarduri, with the River Teesta flowing between them. To go from one PS to the other by road, one had to cover a distance of 75 kilometers, a long stretch of this being in Jalpaiguri district, about 45 kilometers. The biggest enclave of erstwhile East Pakistan, now Bangladesh, named Dahagram, is near a place called Kukaliberi in Meekleganj PS. It remains separated from mainland East Pakistan, now Bangladesh in Panberi PS by a mere 3 bighas of the Indian territory. It is because of this measure of 3 bighas that the place is called Tin Bigha. Consequent to the Indira Mujib Pact of 1974, India provided a corridor through its territory for the movement of Bangladeshi nationals from their mainland to the enclave and vice versa. The corridor runs 24/7 except for an hour for raising the Indian flag. During the 1965 war with Pakistan, there was an exchange of fires in Tin Bigha. The population of Meekleganj town was hardly 4,000 at our times. Meekleganj was not a municipal town in those days. It had a town committee for self-governance. Huldibari block of the subdivision, too, was similarly placed. Residential houses were mostly built of wood with roofs in corrugated iron sheets. Before the annexation, Cooch Behar, to which Meekleganj belonged, was a princely state under the Maharaja of Cooch Behar. According to local information, residents were not allowed to have RCC roofs on their houses during Maharaja's regime. Or else, it could be due to the occurrence of frequent earthquakes or excessive rainfalls in the past. That explains why the houses were mostly tin-roofed. The government offices and the quarters were, mostly, in Pakka buildings with RCC roofs. Meekleganj had only a few shops, all located in the market area near SDO's office. There used to be weekly yachts in the market area. Meekleganj had a special type of small fish called barola. This fish was very tasteful but short in supply. The nearest district town was Jalpaiguri, 47 kms away. Cooch Behar, the headquarters of the district to which Meekleganj belonged, was situated at a distance of 107 kms by the Fairweather Road, which remained inaccessible during the rainy season. One had to take a circuitous route via NH31 to reach Cooch Behar from Meekleganj during the rainy season. There was no railway link to Meekleganj. The nearest rail station was at New Mainaguri, district Jalpaiguri, a place at a distance of 20-25 kms from Meekleganj. Earlier, there had been a railway branch line up to Changrabandha, a distance of 8 kms from Meekleganj, but that link had snapped in 1968, lines being washed away by the North Bengal floods that year. This link was restored long after I had left Meekleganj. This rail track has the potentiality of connecting Bangladesh via Beerhampori of that country. The only means for movement in and out of Meekleganj at our times was road transport. North Bengal State Transport Corporation, NBSTC, used to run a few buses at specified hours. Some private buses plied to and from Depraha, a place beyond Tin Bigha, on selected days. These were all. The first NBSTC bus originated from Meekleganj at 6 a.m. and the last at 4 p.m. In between, there were 2 or 3 timings for bus services. After 4 p.m., Meekleganj became disconnected from the rest of the world. Road transport is still the only means of movement in Meekleganj, as of 2015, though availability has improved manifold in frequency and mode. Meekleganj had a junior high and a higher secondary school but did not have any college. Though a subdivisional town, there was no subdivisional hospital here, it had only a primary health center. A bank had set up a branch of it at Meekleganj towards the later part of my tenure. That was, however, not a branch of the State Bank of India. It was due to this that the Treasury had to do government cash transactions as well, even after the place had got a bank. All these deficiencies seem to have been made good as of December 2015. Friends and acquaintance in Meekleganj. Civil officers at Meekleganj were very few, and social and cultural life was dull. There were very few people outside the official circle with whom one could build acquaintance. I somehow managed to spend 4 long, painful years with some of the friends I had picked up here. Amongst my friends were Balachakrabarti of my service, Deepak Mukherjee, and Satish Kumar Taneja from registration service. Taneja had also stayed with me in my official quarters for some time. He later joined the WBCS. He was posted in Darjeeling and was working, inter alia, as the officer in charge, census when I had joined as the Deputy Director of Census Operations in 1981. At that time, I had once stayed with my family in his quarters for a night in the course of my tour to Darjeeling. That was when we got acquainted with his wife and her lovely children. We had also made friends with the assistant commandants of BSF posted at Mekliganj to guard the borders. Vipul Sengupta, Samir Mitra, and Harbhajan Singh Gill were some of our friends from BSF. Vipul had later left BSF to become a lecturer in a college. Samir later retired as Deputy Inspector General, BSF, and settled in Calcutta. Later, in April 1970, after the separation of the judiciary from the executive in Cooch Behar district, we had amongst ourselves excellent judicial officers like Mr. Sukhendu Bikash Dasgupta, Asit Baran Lahiri, Binoi Kar, and others. I also had a good friend in Heben Kanai Saha, posted in the SSB as sub-area organizer at that time. He stayed in Cooch Behar but at times visited us unannounced, at the dead of night. While visiting Mekliganj, he stayed with me in my bachelor days and once with his family in my post-marriage life. He was pleasant company. My best friend Daipo had visited me in Mekliganj twice, once in my bachelor days and again after my marriage. Needless to say, he had stayed with me on both occasions. We had spent some good moments together after long years. Once during my bachelor's days here, I had gone all the way to a place called Nagarkota to meet one of my college friends, Debashis Nandi. Debashis had joined there as an assistant engineer, PWD, roads. We had met after long years and had spent the day together, sharing the pain and pleasure of bygone days. Political scenario. Madhusudan Roy was the local MLA when I had joined. He belonged to the Congress Party. We were on good terms with him. He was the one outside the official circle with whom we occasionally used to spend some time. Amar Roy Pradhan of the Forward Bloc living in Haldibari had later defeated him in an election to become MLA. I had, on a couple of occasions, interacted with Mr. Roy Pradhan in official matters when I was at Haldibari. He was a nice man. Satyen Mazumdar had been the local leader of the Forward Bloc party at Mekliganj. He often led demonstration/deputation to the SDO on various issues. Bala had once told me Satyen Babu often became aggressive while leading deputation to SDO and it fell upon Bala to do the unpleasant job of restraining Satyen Babu from closing into the SDO. As the third officer, being in charge of the Treasury, I did not have much to interact with him, besides exchanging pleasantries or receiving a deputation or two led by him, in the absence of the SDO and the second officer. Lack of entertainment and people to mix. What we lacked most in Mekliganj was the source of entertainment. Even for a movie, we had to go to nearby Jalpaiguri town. Very often, we failed to have even 4 persons together to play cards. As the only source of entertainment, Mekliganj used to have some Jatra performances organized in winter, and at times football tournaments. Well-known performing parties from Calcutta participated in Jatra. I remember to have watched some of these Jatras till small hours, particularly after Bala had left. Games did not attract me. Conclusion. In the final analysis, I may say, Mekliganj may be a good place to spend a couple of days in peace and tranquility on occasional visits. But for someone with an urban background, it may be tormenting, particularly if he is a bachelor and required to stay for a long time. The way I had suffered here. During my stay at Mekliganj, I had lost contact with the world outside. Most of my old friends, too, could not be in touch with me. There were very few people at Mekliganj to interact besides those in the official circle. Though I had acquired some good friends, they could not fill the void in me. The place being far off from Calcutta and having a shortage of officers working here, The scope to visit Kolkata by availing of leave to enjoy the company of my friends or the pleasure of city life did not, practically, exist. My reading habit had also suffered for want of reading materials. There was not even a good bookshop here. The general library was full of old books, one could hardly find books of one's interest there. Often the time beyond office hours hanged heavy on me. I idled away the time listening to music after I had acquired a transistor. I favored listening to songs in the radio salon program Geetmala presented by Amin Sohni. Since my birth and before coming to this place, I had lived in a district town or a metropolis. It was, in real terms, a punishment for me to live in the rural atmosphere of Meekleganj. Looking back, I feel, at times, that I would have been happier if this chapter on Meekleganj were not in my life. True, I had gained many experiences in my personal and official life. But those had cost me many good things in life too. I had to give away the best 4 years of my youth to this God-forsaken place. My stay in an environment devoid of social and cultural life for years had caused mental constriction in me. Every moment of my bachelor days here, I had suffered the pains of loneliness. I felt from within my heart why officers were afraid of taking up an assignment at this place. Within me, I was not the same man when I left this place. Transfer and moving out. I was transferred to the Kalna subdivision of Burdwan district in May 1972. I left Meekleganj on the 19th of December 1972. The delay was due to successive officers appointed to replace me declining to move to Meekleganj. As I have already said, most of my service colleagues would consider Meekleganj a God-forsaken place and would avoid going there unless compelled. I couldn't blame them after what I had gone through here. I could ultimately move at the intervention of B.C. Sharma, Joint Secretary of the then Home, G.A., Department, who had been my district magistrate in more than one district, and of whom I have spoken earlier in this memoir. Had he not been there, I don't know for how many more years I would have to rot in this place. I had joined my post at Meekleganj as a probationer but left as a confirmed officer in the service. I joined the SDO's office, Kalna, as Deputy Magistrate and Deputy Collector on December 26, 1972. Kalna was politically disturbed at that time. Several political murders had taken place in a short span before I had joined. The Congress had come to power shortly before, by an ill-famous rigged election held under the president's rule. Siddhartha Shankar Roy became the chief minister. A dreadful Naxal movement had spread over the state at that time. What followed was one of the most virulent campaigns of combing areas, clearing of Naxal and left activists. Thousands of Naxals were taken to custody and kept for years without trial, while hundreds were physically eliminated. The Marxist Communist Party, too, had resorted to coercive and violent politics to gain ground. Congress was hell-bound to suppress these movements. The diverse interests that had come into play had created a critical situation for law and order all over the state, and more particularly, in urban areas and some pockets of rural Bengal. On arrival in Kalna, we put up in a privately owned rented house, which the SDO had arranged for us before we had arrived. It was a newly constructed house, good to stay. It was in a good locality called Vidyasagarpura, but a little off from the central place of the town and the office. Later, we shifted to a more secured and conveniently located house. This latter house was in a two-storied building fortified by high compound walls on all sides. It was in the center of the town. The house owners in both the cases were good people, and we didn't have anything against them. There were no government quarters in Kalna, except a bungalow, on the bank of the river Ganga, for the SDO. The SDO's office was a little off from the center of the town, 15 to 20 minutes walk from our house. I had to walk down or take a rickshaw to the office. The office was on the bank of the river Ganga on a beautiful landscape. Officers and the staff at Kalna were dutiful and cooperative. I was the second officer, meaning next to the SDO in the administrative hierarchy. I held executive court as the subdivisional magistrate in the absence of the SDO and did other magisterial and administrative work, including block visits. I also held charge of the office of the Subdivisional Land Reforms Officer at times. Of the judicial officers posted in the subdivision, Sri Bijan Bihari Chaklanabis was the subdivisional judicial magistrate and Sri Mana Sengupta was the judicial magistrate, first class. They were very good people, cordial and helpful. I had cordial and friendly relations with both of them. We were, so to say, family friends. Mr. Chaklanabis later became law secretary to the government of West Bengal and Mr. Sengupta a high court judge. Besides the SDO and me, there was another officer named Ashok Ghana in the SDO's office. Ashok was also a WBCS, executive, officer, 3 years junior to me. Later, when his turn came, Ashok had joined the IAS on promotion but had reverted to the parent cadre of WBCS, executive, subsequently. Kalna was a temple town situated on the bank of the river Ganga or the Bhagirathi. The town was also known as Ambika Kalna after the name of the deity Kali or Ambika. The first reference to Ambika Kalna was found in a 6th century text named Kubjaka Tantra. According to General Alexander Cunningham, the founder of the Archaeological Survey of India, Ambika Kalna was a frontier city of the Tamralipta kingdom in the 7th century AD. During the reign of Shashanka in the 7th century, a hyper-naval base was founded at Kalna. Kalna housed the only Chaitanya temple built in Sri Chaitanya's lifetime. It was the renowned abode of pilgrimage for the Vaishnavites. It was a celebrated place during the Muhammadan rule in the 15th century. Kalna reached its pinnacle of glory during the late 18th century under the patronage of the Maharajas of Bardhaman, who built several magnificent temples with intricate terracotta ornamentation. Every edifice in Ambika Kalna oozes history. It bears the testimony of the diversity of India's cultural and religious heritage. Here we have living glimpses of Jainism, Shakti cult, Sharia cult, Vaishnava cult, Buddhism as well as Christian and Islamic cult. Info source, Wikipedia. A major landmark was the Siddheshwari Kali temple in the center of the town. Besides the Siddheshwari temple, there were several other temples and monuments, most with a historical background. Some of these were Rajbari, Sri Gauranga Mandir, and 108 Shiv temples. In Sri Gauranga Mandir, were retained Sri Chaitanya's manuscript and his personal belongings. At the entrance of the mandir, was a neem tree under which were giant footprints embossed on a slab of stone. These were believed to be the footprints of Sri Chaitanya. In 108 Shiv Mandir, built in 1809, the Shiv temples were constructed in 2 circles of 74 and 34 temples. The first circle had white and black stone Shivlings, and the second had all marble Shivlings. Because of ingenious planning, all the Shivlings could be seen from the center of the temple complex. Other temples in Kalna were Nabakailasha Temple, Kalna Rashmancha, Kalna Temple Complex, Pratapeshvar Temple, Krishna Chandraji Temple, Lalji Temple, Rupeswar Temple, Mahaprabhu Temple, Mahasmardani Temple, Nityananda Temple, Theravada Buddha Temple. We had visited a village fair at a place called Burro Shivtala, a little off from Kalna town. This was an annual fair where people from far and wide participated irrespective of their religious beliefs. There was a large Shiva lingam in a thatched hut centering which the fair used to take place. Kalna was socially and culturally quite developed. People here were social, cultured, entertaining, and loved music. It had a cinema hall which we often visited with families. The town went into 4 days ecstasy during its famous festival of Mahasmardani. There used to be an excellent presentation of fireworks at a place in Kalna, 2 block during the Dussehra. We, the officers, and our families went from Kalna and stayed late at night to witness this extravaganza. BDO, Kalna too made all arrangements for us. Sri P. Mukherjee, an aged, promoted officer, was the BDO there. There, however, was no club or meeting place for officers in Kalna. We used to meet at one another's house to keep in social contact. The cost of living at Kalna was lesser than that in many other towns. Fresh fish and vegetables were available in plenty. Kalna, being an old town, the roads here were narrow. The rickshaw was the main transport for the movement within the town. Kalna had all the amenities expected of a subdivisional town, viz., schools, college, subdivisional hospital, banks, etc. It was well connected through the railways and the roadways. The differences with my previous station of Mekliganj from where I had moved lately were striking. Like other temple towns, Kalna, too, was beset with monkeys. Very often, these monkeys would enter residences and take away fruits and vegetables. Once, when my wife was pregnant with my first child, she, after waking up from her afternoon nap, found a monkey sitting on her dressing table looking at itself in the life-size mirror. She was scared, but the monkey peacefully left the room and went out of the house after some time. I had very friendly SDOs at Kalna. The first was Bubtosh Chakrabarti of our service, who was a connoisseur of music. His wife, Nivedita, was a nice woman. She was an MSc in mathematics. They had a daughter Munmun and a twin of a boy and a girl. The boy passed from Narendrapur Ramankrishna Mission, did MBBS and MD from AIMS, Delhi. He joined Ramankrishna Mission and later became a monk there. His parents and we were family friends in Kalna. Mr. Chakrabarti was a nice man and like an elder brother to me. We used to visit places together with families, and at times, had picnics on the riverbed and elsewhere. One of the local advocates, the name I forgot, accompanied us in a riverbed picnic and killed a few river gulls with his gun. These gulls were very tasteful to eat. My next SDO was Mr. V. Subramanian, a young IAS officer on his first subdivisional posting. He also had the professional degree of a chartered accountant. He was a good young man free of ego or inhibition. He was eager to learn and did not mind being pointed out the mistakes. Soon we became very close. He also visited my house at times and had food with us. Once, his mother and sister came from his native place in Tamil Nadu. He invited my wife and me to lunch. After lunch, the ladies were taking a rest and gossiping without knowing each other's language. Subramanian drew my attention to it, wondering aloud how they were communicating amongst themselves. We enjoyed the situation. Later, Mr. Subramanian served as the secretaries and the principal secretaries in various departments of the government of West Bengal. Because of adherence to rules and principles, he was never in the good book of political masters in the left regime and was subjected to frequent transfers when in West Bengal. He finally retired as a secretary to the Government of India after holding several senior positions at that level, including Civil Aviation Secretary. I was also on good terms with the SDPO, Mr. V.K. Mehta. Much later, when posted as the Deputy Commissioner of Police for the port area in Calcutta, Mr. Mehta was brutally killed by ruffians in broad daylight while conducting an anti-rowdy operation in Kidarpur. I was posted in Calcutta at the time of this tragic incident. Naturally, I became very upset when I came to know of it. Later, his widow Mrs. Pinky Mehta came to live with her son in the housing estate where we had been staying. The government of West Bengal had allotted her a flat in that housing estate and had provided her employment on compassionate grounds. While at Kalna, my first child, a daughter later named Ananditha alias Maman, was born in a nursing home in Krishnanagar. My expecting wife was staying with one of her aunts in Krishnanagar at the advanced stage of her pregnancy, while I stayed back at my place of work. It was a special kind of feeling to become a first-time father. I had enjoyed it to the fullest with my wife so long as I was here. I had, however, missed much of the joy of seeing her grow up while I could not give her much time, being busy in my official duties at the next place of posting. I was further deprived of this charm when she remained away from me with her mother at her aunt's place where I had to send them to avoid scorching heat at the place we stayed next. My brother had come with my mother to Kalna after my daughter's birth. He had left after some time while my mother stayed with us. We had amongst our friends at Kalna one Dr. Aravinda Nandi and his wife. Dr. Nandi was attached to Kalna Hospital. We became quite friendly and often visited each other's house. Both Dr. Nandi and his wife were jovial. We also had a friend in Dr. Bera, a child specialist of Kalna Hospital. Dr. Bera was a bachelor. After my daughter was born, he attended to her health needs. We had another acquaintance Amal Sengupta, who was the sanitary inspector in Kalna municipality. Sengupta, too, was very close to us and took care of the post-birth immunization requirements of my daughter. He was a likable personality. When my child was 5 months old, I received an order posting me as project officer of a centrally sponsored project, named Pilot Intensive Rural Employment Project or PIREP in short in remote Nayagram block of Jaragram subdivision in the undivided Midnapuri district. I was initially reluctant to move to that interior place with a 5-month-old child. I met the Joint Secretary Home, GA, Mr. B.C. Sharma, to explain my difficulties in taking up the assignment. He told me that he had posted me on the consideration that the post carried a special pay, which could be useful for me. If, however, I had difficulty, he would get the order cancelled. Later, I learned that it would be a short-term assignment. The project would be wound up on March 31, 1976. Considering this, I honored the government decision and left Kalna to take up the assignment at Nayagram on July 7, 1974. Till then, I did not have any personal knowledge about the place. We had enjoyed our stay at Kalna, though it was short. I had joined PIREP or Pilot Intensive Rural Employment Project, at Nayagram on July 15, 1974, and had continued till the project was wound up on March 31, 1976. PIREP was a central sector pilot project taken up in the backward areas at the rate of 1 for each state. In West Bengal, it was Nayagram, the most backward area of the state with a large concentration of tribal population, 40.01% by 2011 census. It was a multidisciplinary project designed primarily to provide rural employment through the creation of assets in various sectors like roads and tanks, forestry, soil conservation, animal husbandry, fishery, etc. Schemes for roads and tanks were executed through the project officer, while schemes in other sectors were executed by the district-level departmental officers through their designated officials. There were departmental officers posted at the project level to oversee the execution of soil conservation and small irrigation schemes. The project officer was to provide laborers for deployment in the departmental schemes under PIREP. In that way, the project office also acted as an employment exchange in a limited sphere. The project headquarters was located at a small place called Karakamatani in a rural backdrop. The block headquarters was at a place called Balagiria 1.5/2 kms away, and the police station was at a place called Nayagram, almost an equal distance from project headquarters, on its other side. The population of Karakamatani was meager. There used to be a weekly yacht at Karakamatani, where villagers from around brought commodities for sale. There was hardly any suitable accommodation to stay at Karakamatani. My predecessor in office, a batchmate of mine in service, had stayed in a 2-roomed accommodation in a barrack-type structure, which also accommodated some other officers and offices in side-by-side rooms. I occupied the accommodation vacated by my predecessor. The rear side of this house was enclosed by a compound wall. There was no electricity in Nayagram PS, dug wells were the only source of potable water. We had in our residential premises a ring well fitted with a hand pump for our exclusive use. Nayagram being in the late right zone, the quality of the water here was good. Summer at Nayagram was extremely hot and dry. The sun would be fierce and almost parched the earth. I used to send my wife and child to my eldest sister-in-law's house at Bulbulchandi, Malda, during the summer to save them from the scorching heat. My office was close to my residence. It was housed in a 2-roomed brick structure with the roof of corrugated iron sheets. It was a small office with an accountant, a cashier, a few sub-assistant engineers, and Group D staff. As there was no electricity, manual punkas had to be put in use during the summer. Some seasonal workers, known as punka pullers, were employed for this purpose. These punkas would consist of a long rectangular sheet of the mat without decorative cloth at its lower edge attached to a wooden bar and suspended from the hooks hanging from the ceiling with 3 or 4 cords. Another cord tied at the center of the bar would pass over a pulley fixed on the inside wall, go through that wall and over another pulley at the corresponding point of the outer wall to finally land on the hand of a menial who would pull the cord swinging the punka inside to generate cool air for those sitting there. It was often a funny sight to see a punka puller dozing off in the midst of his activity. The subdivisional headquarters Jafarganj was located at a distance of about 80 km from the project office. We had to visit it at intervals to draw cash from the treasury and related work. To reach Jafarganj, we had to cross the river Subarnarekha at Kuti Ghat, at a distance of 25/30 km from the project headquarters. We crossed the river with the vehicle on a raft. There was no bridge over Subarnarekha at Kuti Ghat in those days. During the rainy season, when the river was in spate, we had to detour via Barrapada in the bordering state of Orissa for a distance of 230 km, to reach Jafarganj. On one such occasion when I was returning from Jafarganj after some official work, I could not cross the river Subarnarekha at Kuti Ghat owing to a sudden high spate in the river and had to spend the night in Hazarduri Forest Bungalow. I had my family, including my younger sister-in-law, with me. We had to detour through a stretch of Orissa, including its forest areas and the forest area of Jafarganj, to reach Hazarduri. The next day, we returned to the headquarters via Shatinasol, the block headquarters of Gopi Ballabhpur. Once, while driving along the Karakamathani-Kutagat road on the way to Jafarganj, I had run over a billy goat running across the road. It was early morning, and the goat suddenly came running out of the roadside bush, and fell in front of the car. There was no way to save it. That was the only accident involving the loss of life while I was steering a vehicle. The project used to employ more than 10,000 rural people at a time during the lean season. Most of the people employed were tribal, mostly Santals, some Lodas, and the rest Mahtos. They were simple, honest, and hard-working. Their womenfolk also participated in hard work and gave similar labor as their male counterpart. These people used to be deployed in groups of 20 persons headed by a group leader, locally called mate. The mates, who could read and write, were to keep the record of attendance and measurement of work done by each group. Above the group leader was a supervisor to oversee a few groups. Finally, for schemes executed through project officer, the sub-assistant engineers prepared the schemes and supervised execution. I used to visit the work sites unannounced from time to time to keep supervisory staff alert and to ensure that things were in order. None, not even my driver, knew till the last moment as to which work site I would visit. During some of my initial surprise inspections, I came across incidents of recording false attendance of the laborers. It meant pilferage of money in the form of wages for those ghost laborers. This could not happen without the active connivance of concerned mates and supervisors. In the form I had designed for attendance, I had provided for certification of attendance under the signatures of mates, supervisors, and the inspecting officials. I could, therefore, immediately find out the mates and the supervisors involved in drawing up false records. I recorded my findings on the attendance sheet. Later, I struck the names of delinquent mates and supervisors off the employment list and stopped at that in the first few instances. When I found this was not effective to the desired extent, I started lodging FIR against the culprits in addition to expelling them from work. Concerned SAEs were also alerted. This time, I had the desired results, and such incidents came down to a large extent, as evidenced during my later days' surprise inspections. I was happy to learn later when I was posted elsewhere that some of the culprits, against whom I had lodged FIR, were convicted. An immediate impact of the project on the local population was the betterment of their economic condition. A large section of the tribal population here lived in extreme poverty, they even had to live, at times, on wild potatoes and some kinds of roots and stems growing in the forest areas. The large-scale employment under the project provided them with the means to meet their minimum basic needs. There was no restriction on the number of persons from a family that could work in the project. A family thus had the option to increase its income by enrolling more of its adult members for the project work. Due to the development of rural roads, communication between villages improved and accessibility to available medical facilities and the marketability of the local produce became easier. The development of animal husbandry, fisheries, and forestry opened up the scopes for future employment to a certain extent. Soil conservation, minor irrigation schemes, and tank improvement measures ensured better retention of the runoff water. As people had money in their hands, crimes of theft, snatching, robbery, etc. came down, showing marked improvement of law and order situation. Sri Dashrathi Saran, belonging to the Congress Party, was the local MLA. He was simple and non-interfering. He visited the office at times with demand for some schemes in the immediate neighborhood of his house. He had been pestering for a road scheme to lead to the area around his house since the time of my predecessor. But this could not be taken up due to the cost being not commensurate with benefit. Besides, there was a wide channel to cross over on the alignment for the proposed road. The project did not provide for any material-intensive scheme like the construction of a bridge. Once Ajit Punjat, now deceased, the then minister in charge of health and family welfare in the government of West Bengal, had visited the PIREP office. Some local congressmen had made some complaints about the manner of execution of schemes or deployment of labors, contents of which I no longer remember. But the minister, after ascertaining the factual position from me, severely reprimanded those who had come with the complaint. The political atmosphere was congenial for developmental work. There was an All India Conference on PIREP in New Delhi on February 22, 1975, which I had attended along with other concerned officials from West Bengal. While in PIREP, I had a short course training on agriculture labor at the National Institute of Community Development, Hyderabad, later named as National Institute of Rural Development, in January 1976. At that time, I had visited Golconda Fort and Hasansagar. The security warning system of the fort was demonstrative of the high skills and the technological knowledge of the people of that age. The sound of claps at the security post at the entrance of the fort reverberated through its hollow columns and was distinctly heard at the watchtower, a few hundred feet above, and vice versa. At that time, I had also visited Salayung Museum in Hyderabad. The Salayung Museum is the third largest museum in India, housing the biggest one-man collection of antiques in the world. It is well known throughout India for its prized collection belonging to different civilizations dating back to the 1st century. The museum building had 38 galleries spread on 2 floors. The exhibits on different subjects were displayed in separate galleries. There were Aurangzeb's daggers belonging to Empress Noorjahan, Emperors Jahangir and Shah Jahan, the turbans and chair of Tipu Sultan, furniture from Egypt, paintings on display. Among the sculptures stood out the world-famous statue of Veiled Rebecca by G. B. Benzoni, an Italian sculptor who had made it in 1876. Rebecca's beautiful face was visible hazily through a marble, gossamer veil. It was a great experience to view this matchless work of sculpture. It was so lively that it made one wonder how such an animated form could be carved in marble. A bewildering variety and array of clocks greeted the visitor in the clock room. There were ancient sundials in the form of obelisks to huge and modern clocks of the 20th century. Others in the range varied from miniature clocks which needed a magnifying glass to imbibe their beauty and complexity to stately grandfather clocks from as far away as France, Germany, Italy, Switzerland, and Britain. A visual delight was the musical clock Salayung had bought from Cook and Kelvey of England. Every hour, a timekeeper emerged from the upper deck of the clock to strike a gong as many times as it was the hours of the day. There was a separate gallery for paintings, where paintings of renowned artists, including those of Jiminy Roy's famous ones, were on display. Background info source, Wikipedia. I had also undergone a short course training at the Indian Institute of Public Administration, New Delhi, sometimes before my above training in the National Institute of Community Development. An important national event of far-reaching consequences had occurred during my tenure here. This was the declaration of the state of emergency in India promulgated on June 25, 1975. It was declared when an emergency due to external aggression of 1971 was already in force. Some of the causes for the declaration of the 1975 emergency were inciting calls to the military and the police not to obey the orders of the government and interrupting the normal functioning of government, violent political activities to stop the democratic functioning of the government. There was even an attempt on the life of the then Chief Justice of India. Though emergency brought discipline in public services to some extent, there were too many excesses and oppressions in various spheres of public life. People did not approve of it. Finally, on March 21, 1971, emergency was lifted by Prime Minister Indira Gandhi. The project was wound up on the March 31, 1976. An officer from the DM, Midnapuri's office, took charge of the documents and the assets on the afternoon of March 31, 1976. I left Nayagram on the 1st of April 1976. I had enjoyed working on the project even though the place lacked the amenities of urban life, and I had to take the additional trouble of sending out my family every summer. The project gave me an opportunity to work with tribal people and know their way of living. Nayagram was a backward development block in the undivided Midnapuri district. It lacked the bare necessities for a decent life. Of the deficiencies the place suffered from, the most glaring was the basic health provisions. There was no pharmacy or hospital except a primary health center at Nayagram. If my child fell ill, she had to be taken to Jaragram for treatment. Luckily, none of us had any major illness during the period we had stayed here. I was, however, attacked with chickenpox while working here. The place did not have electricity, potable water source of entertainment, or any social or cultural life. It is praiseworthy for my wife to have stayed at a place like this for nearly 2 years without even a murmur, and that, too, with a small child and at the prime of her married life. Before I end this chapter, I reiterate that the special pay attached to the post here had to be earned at the cost of all comforts and amenities of civilized life. After having served in general administration in Midnapuri for 4 months, I left for Jaragram to head a centrally sponsored project called DPAP. On the 5th of August 1976, I joined this project Midnapuri Drought Prone Area Program, DPAP, agency, the project officer with headquarters at Jaragram. DPAP was a multidisciplinary project for the development of drought-prone areas, sponsored by the Government of India and executed by the Agriculture Department of the Government of West Bengal. There were 2 other such projects in West Bengal, one being in Bankura and the other in Purulia. To implement the program, an agency was created, as a non-firm society, in each of the districts with the concerned district magistrate as the chairman and the district officers of the participating departments as its members. The project officer was the member secretary of this committee. There was no office or staff when I joined as the project officer at Jaragram. I had to build up the infrastructure from scratch. A suitable office building was not available on hire. I had to hire a big house to accommodate the office and the residents in the same building, though I was not in favor of having my residence on the same premises as the office. Office and residence were separated later, as soon as suitable accommodation was available, but that was much later. Fair rent for the premises, including that for the residential portion of the building, was determined by the Land Reforms Wing of the Collectorate. Having occupied the premises of office cum residence, I appointed a retired person as the accountant of the agency. Next, I filled up the sanctioned posts of staff through a written test followed by an interview. For the written test, I had set the question paper myself and had personally cyclostyled it for circulation amongst the examines. I had to take the assistance of personnel from the SDO for conducting the test. I also purchased for the project a fiberglass body Jeep from the manufacturer, Mahindra and Mahindra at the DGS&D rate, and recruited the driver for the same. Simultaneously, I bought furniture and equipment for the office. The office started working in full swing within 6 months of my joining. Of course, the officers to act as subject matter specialists, one from the Cooperation Department and the other from the Animal Husbandry Department, were available from the government much later. Funds were received from the government as grants in aid and kept in the agency's Bank A/C, operated jointly by the project officer and the district magistrate as chairman of the agency. The agency was to provide funds out of this grant to the district officers for execution of its schemes from time to time. Accounts of the project used to be audited by the Accountant General at the office of the agency as well as at the offices of the executing authorities. Schemes under the project were drawn up following the guidelines of the Government of India and executed by the district-level officers of the concerned departments. As the project officer, I was to coordinate and maintain close liaison with the concerned officials of different departments for smooth implementation of the schemes and release funds when needed by the executing officers. There used to be regular meetings at the convenience of the district magistrate to monitor the progress of work in different sectors. State-level meetings were also held in Calcutta from time to time to assess the progress and remove interdepartmental bottlenecks, wherever required. Besides, monthly reports on the progress of work were to be sent regularly to the government. Dryland farming, small irrigation, soil conservation, forestry, fishery, and irrigation were the sectors that worked within the project. Ramsevak Bandyopadhyay was the SDO, Jafarganj when I joined as project officer, DPAP. I had good friendly relation with him. That was Ramsevak's first posting as an IAS officer, and he needed to learn many things. Often, he would take me along when he visited the block offices and different other places in the Jafarganj subdivision. I helped him in conducting the parliamentary election, 1977. I recall here an incident that had occurred at that time. It was on the poll day. I was sitting with the SDO, Jafarganj, in his chamber, which was functioning as the election control room. We received information that a reporter from a local newspaper Banabasi Samachar was taking photographs inside a polling booth. It was an illegal act. Asking me to stay, the SDO Ramsevak Bandyopadhyay went out. After some time, he returned holding a camera in hand. He told me he had seized the camera and would get the pictures developed. It was a film camera, the digital camera had not arrived till then. I told him, what he proposed to do, would be illegal, as per rules, the camera reel should be exposed to light to destroy the negatives. SDO kept on insisting on developing the negatives. After much persuasion, he reluctantly did as I had advised. No sooner had he done this, there came a call from the district magistrate, Bengal, wanting to know from the SDO if he had seized any camera from the polling booth. Having the reply in the affirmative, the district magistrate, in so far as I could gather from the reply of the SDO, asked him what he had done with it. SDO reported that he had exposed the negatives to sunlight. There was possibly some other query by the DM which was beyond my hearing. But I heard the SDO saying, but Mr. Das had advised me to destroy them. There ended the conversation. Mr. Hirak Ghosh, since deceased, was the district magistrate of Midnapuri at that time. Once during Ramsevak's stay in Jafarganj, J.C. Sengupta, the then additional chief secretary, visited Jafarganj in connection with some ILO program. Ramsevak told me later that Mr. Sengupta made him accept even the cost of tea and snacks served to him in the course of his visit. Such was the standard of honesty of these officers in those days. During my tenure as project officer, I attended an all-India training program on DPAP for a fortnight at a place called Yelwal in the outskirts of Mysore city. For this training, I flew via Madras, it was still not named Chennai, to Bangalore, where I halted at a hotel as it was late in the night by the time I had reached there. This was the first air travel in my service life. The next morning, I boarded the tourist train Vrindaban Express, running between Bangalore and Mysore, at Bangalore, to reach Mysore. I reached Mysore in about 3 hours, and from there, went to the University of Mysore to report for training. The organizers led me to the venue of the training. The training was conducted by the Department of Development Studies, University of Mysore, and the cost borne by the Government of India. It was an all-India level training. Project heads from DPAP districts all over India had attended. We were 3 from the 3 projects of West Bengal. We used to have classes from morning till around 5:30 p.m. with a break for lunch. University professors and guest lecturers used to take the classes. In the classes, we used to have talks and deliberation on development-oriented matters, dryland farming, special problems of drought-prone areas, and the ways to combat them. I recount here an episode not related to the training program, which had moved me to a certain extent. Some girl students of Mysore University had some of their classes near the venue of our training. We used to come by them during the class break. I noticed a Tamil girl amongst them, quite good-looking, showing interest in me. While passing by us, she would smile and often cast love glances at me. It would be a travesty of truth if I say I was not attracted. I was a little over 32 years of age at that time. But I restrained myself and ignored it. I was already married with a child. I did not want anything untoward to happen to them. During that training, we, the trainees, were taken to the historical places of Bellur and Sravnabelagola. Both Bellur and Sravnabelagola were in the district of Hassan in the state of Karnataka. Bellur was the early capital of the Hosla Empire. It was known for the Chennakesva temple, one of the finest examples of Hosla workmanship. We visited the temple. We were mesmerized by its exquisite beauty. Sravnabelagola was one of the most important pilgrimage destinations in Jainism, one that had reached a peak in architectural and sculptural activity under the patronage of the Western Ganga dynasty of Talakad. There was a gigantic statue of Gamateshvara Bahubali on the top of a hillock at Sravnabelagola. We had to climb a large number of stairs to have a look at it. We stayed at Mysore only for 2 weeks to complete our course. Even during this short period, the city and its people had earned a soft corner in my heart. I had visited Mysore twice since then, once with colleagues as a part of the Bharat Darshan program of the IAS induction training course, and later again, with the family. Details of these visits are available on the travelogue page of my website. During my tenure as project officer, DPAP, there was a devastating flood in August 1978. The flood had affected most of the districts of South Bengal and Calcutta. The state government had deployed officers from different places to combat the flood situation. In the Midnapuri district, Tamluk and Gudal subdivisions were the worst affected. I was detailed for flood duty at Tamluk with Svapan Chakrabarti, an IAS officer, posted as the settlement officer, Midnapuri. We moved together. Reaching Tamluk was difficult. We could make it at great efforts. We started in the morning and reached Tamluk in the evening via Kantai. Normally, it would take a couple of hours to reach Tamluk from Midnapuri. Our attempt to reach Tamluk directly via Pungskara had failed as the national highway had been inaccessible after the bridge on the Damodar. Kalyan Bugji was the ADM, Tamluk at that time. He was a nice friendly man, free from ego. While at Tamluk for flood relief operation, I stayed in the house of the subdivisional police officer, Kirit Sen Gupta, who was my batchmate in the WBCS. He had gone for the police service, as his guest. His family was away at that time. The next morning, Kirit and I were detailed for Mekita, a development block of the Tamluk subdivision. There was information that the local villagers had taken shelter on the first floor of Mekita BDO's office at Katia. The BDO Chittaranjan Das was in bad shape. He had been living in a subhuman condition. We left for Mekita by boat. Waist-deep water was flowing over the road, and the cracking of collapsing houses was being heard from around. People were calling for help and rescue. Boats were in crying need for rescue operations. We felt we should release the boat for rescue operations and move on foot. We did so and moved on foot through the waist-deep water. It took us longer to cover the distance of 8 km to reach BDO's place at Katia. We reached in the evening and helped to distribute relief materials, from a stranded trailer, till late at night. We somehow spent the rest of the night at BDO's place. The ground floor of the BDO's office was underwater, and a large number of people had taken shelter on the first floor. BDO himself was also staying in a first-floor room. There was an unbearable stench all around due to the use of a single toilet in the office by all these people. The BDO, Mr. Chittaranjan Das, was in a run-down state. We felt he would fall sick if not removed from the place at once. The next morning, taking the BDO, Chittaranjan Das, with us, we returned to Tamluk by a stranded truck. Before leaving, the BDO had made all the arrangements for relief and rescue of the affected people to continue in his absence. He returned to his headquarters after being refreshed by some rest and sleep at Tamluk and continued with relief work. At normal times, Chit stayed in Tamluk with his family and attended office from there. I had stayed at Tamluk for a few more days to help in flood relief work. I returned to my headquarters after the water had receded, and the situation had become somewhat normal in Tamluk. The new Panchayat functionaries who had come to power shortly before this calamity had become actively involved in relief and rescue operations. They had done a commendable job during this flood. I left the agency on April 27, 1979, on being appointed as the subdivisional officer, Jaragram. I was succeeded by Trinath Krishna Sinha, a 1970 batch WBCS, executive officer. I joined as the subdivisional officer Jaragram on April 28, 1979. As I had already worked in Jaragram for about 3 years as project officer, DPAP, and a little less than 2 years as project officer, PIREP, I had fairly good knowledge of the area. Officers were also mostly known to me. It helped me to a great extent to run the administration efficiently. There were 8 development blocks and 6 police stations in Jaragram. Binpur and Gopi Ballabhpur PS had 2 development blocks each in its jurisdiction, Binpur, 1 with headquarters at Lalgarh and Binpur 2 with headquarters at Belpahari in Binpur PS and Gopi Ballabhpur, 1 with headquarters at Chatinasol and Gopi Ballabhpur, 2 with headquarters at Beliabara in Gopi Ballabhpur PS. In the early 70s, Gopi Ballabhpur had been a hotbed of Naxal activities. The 6 police stations were Jaragram, Jamboni, Binpur, Gopi Ballabhpur, Nayagram, and Sankarayal. I had taken over as SDO around the time the new Panchayati Raj institutions had come into existence on completion of Panchayat elections, 1978. Gram Panchayats in the setup had to be provided with the staff designated as the job assistants. SDOs were empowered to select candidates for these posts of job assistants at 1 for each Gram Panchayat with the assistance of a committee set up by the government with official and non-official members. There were 81 Gram Panchayats in my area, and 81 candidates were to be selected. One of my first jobs as SDO was to complete this process of selection and do it fairly. It was a tricky job. The Panchayat functionaries who had just come to power had an eye on getting their favored ones in position. I, therefore, had to involve myself personally in the process to thwart all attempts of outside interference. I developed the selection process in line with the government order, taking the recruitment committee in confidence. I took care to see that no exterior factor could come into play in the selection of candidates. I set the questions for recruitment tests myself. The question papers were typed and cyclostyled under my supervision on the morning of the examination day and then sent to the concerned block office for holding the recruitment test. The answer sheets were designed to have a perforated portion for writing names, roll numbers, and other particulars of the examines. After the examination was over and the answer scripts were brought back, I allotted code numbers to the answer scripts and tore off the portions containing the names and other particulars of the candidates. These torn-off portions were kept separately in the sealed covers, in the confidential section of my office, and used to relate the candidates to the marks scored by them after the result sheets came. This process made it impossible for anyone to relate answer scripts to candidates and closed the way to exert undue influence in favor or against a candidate. The evaluation of the answer scripts was entrusted with the BDOs, chosen at random. They were given model answer sheets to work with. I had personally test-checked some answer scripts after BDOs had awarded marks for them. The qualifying marks were set at 40%, the total marks for the written test being 60. Interviews of the candidates who qualified in the written tests were taken by a board of interviews headed by the SDO with 4 out of 7 members from amongst the officers. The marks obtained in the interview by a candidate were arrived at by taking the simple average of the marks awarded by individual members of the board. By this process, bias, if any, from any of the members in awarding the marks got erased. The marks obtained in the written test and the interview were totaled for every candidate in respect of every GP, and a panel of 3 candidates for the concerned Gram Panchayat was prepared in order of merit. The concerned Gram Pradhan was to appoint the first available candidate in this panel. The selection was just and fair. Deserving candidates, irrespective of their political affiliation, got selected. Some of the Gram Pradhans initially declined to appoint the selected candidates as they were not their preferred ones. These cases were dealt with firmly, and the available selected candidates ultimately received their appointments and joined their posts. It may not be out of place to mention here that the official section of the local unit of the party in power was not very happy with the way I had conducted the selection process. But they had to swallow it, as they could not find any flaw in the process or bias towards anybody. My district magistrate, who had a political leaning, would, in an indirect way of putting pressure on me, often ask me to hasten appointments to these vacancies, saying some of the SDOs had already completed it. I would tell him that I was on it, but my process was a little more elaborate and would take some time. I had reasons to believe that in some other subdivisions of the district, the responsibility to conduct the selection process was entrusted by some young SDOs to the Savapatis of Panchayat Sanities, who were political people. Recording of Bargadars under Operation Barga had started in the state at that time. As in other places, this was going on in full swing in the Jaragram subdivision too. An awareness campaign through the evening camps was held in rural areas. In some of these camps, I, too, participated as the SDO. Operation Barga was a priority project of the state government at that time. Thousands of Bargadars got themselves recorded as such in the related land records. They reaped its benefit later. Operation Barga was a joint endeavor of the Ellora and the Settlement Wing of the Land and Land Reforms Department. We used to have an annual fair under the name and style of Jaragram Fair in Jaragram. Tribal art and culture were particularly highlighted in the fair. Tribal dance was a special feature of the fair. Also, stalls were set up displaying items of tribal handicrafts for exhibition and sale. Cultural functions used to be held on the rostrum built up in the fair premises. There used to be visitors from different sections of society. There was an authority named Jaragram Development Board under the chairmanship of the Minister for Jaragram Development for planning and execution of special schemes for the development of Jaragram. The board had an assistant engineer with supporting staffs exclusively for its schemes. During my tenure as SDO, there was a ghastly incident in which 13 Lodas were killed in Nayagram police station area by unknown assailants. The dead bodies were discovered on the sandy bank of the river Subarnarekha near a place called Shandabilla. There was suspicion that the perpetrators were from the Santhal community. Historically, the Lodas, a declining tribe, were racial enemies of the Santhals. They remained engaged in various criminal activities. The British government had notified them as a criminal tribe. After independence, the government of India had denotified them. They lived in the forests. Several attempts by the government to rehabilitate them in the inhabited areas had failed. A few days before this grotesque incident, I had visited the Nayagram area. I had learnt that the police camp, which had been functioning at the place Chandabila, mentioned earlier, had been withdrawn, and since then, the crimes of robbery, snatching, and dacoities had multiplied in that area. People were losing confidence in the police, and there was a general feeling that Lodas were involved in these crimes. From available information, I had felt there could be an organized reprisal against the suspected criminals. I had returned to my headquarters with an uncanny feeling and had immediately written to the Superintendent of Police, Midnapuri, giving my assessment of the prevailing situation in Nayagram. I had asked the SP to re-establish the police camp at Chandabila immediately, with the arrangement for regular patrolling in the area. I had also kept the district magistrate informed. To my knowledge, there was no action, and then within a few days, had happened this heinous crime. It stirred the administration. Various actions, including welfare measures for the Lodas, were then initiated. I have a feeling, adequate and timely action on the lines of my letter could have deterred those involved from taking such an extreme step. After the incident, the district magistrate had written to the SP asking for a report on action taken on my letter. I am not aware of further development in this regard. There was another incident of importance, this time of political ramification. One day, just after my lunch, I received an RT message from the BDO, Gopi Ballabhpur, 1, that he had been abused and manhandled in his office chamber by a local Zilla Parishad member of the CPI-M, and consequent on that he was leaving the headquarters. I asked the BDO to stay back till I reached his office. As I was preparing to leave for the area, I received a telephone call from the district magistrate asking me to tell the BDO not to leave his headquarters and not to lodge FIR. I told the district magistrate that I was proceeding to the place. I would certainly advise the BDO to lodge FIR if I was satisfied that the Zilla Parishad member had done anything wrong. I reached Gopi Ballabhpur and talked to the staff members and other officials of the BDO's office and got a complete picture of all that had happened. All the staff members were agitated, they had already started a pen-down strike. I immediately sent the BDO to the local PS to lodge an FIR. After a little while, the then chairman of Midnapuri Zilla Parishad, who had later become an important minister in the cabinet of Sri Buddhadev Bhattacharjee, accompanied by Sri Deepak Sarkar, the district secretary of the CPI-M, reached the office of the BDO. The chairman of the Zilla Parishad expressed regret over the incident. He wanted the BDO to be advised not to lodge FIR, they would take action on their end. When informed that the FIR had already been lodged, he requested me to keep it suspended for a week. I agreed but told him that, after this period, action on the FIR would automatically start. I advised the subdivisional police officer and the OC of the concerned police station to act accordingly. I ensured that the action on the FIR started immediately after the lapse of 7 days. Later, I learned that the concerned member of the Zilla Parishad had been expelled from his party. The culprit was arrested, and the criminal case started on the FIR pending against him. Afterwards, the pen-down strike by the employees was called off at my request. Finally, in consideration of the actions taken, BDO did not press for leaving the block. Ranjit Mati was the concerned BDO. In the interest of administration, I had to make sure that the culprit did not go scot-free. For, otherwise, people would get encouraged to repeat such incidents, and Tom, Dick, or Harry could enter the BDO's office and abuse the BDO if things did not go his way. It would make it difficult for a BDO in a far-flung area to function efficiently. I had also made this view of mine known to the chairman, Zilla Parishad, and the district secretary of CPI-M, during their visit to BDO's office. I was happy that the culprit had been adequately punished, and the matter had been settled satisfactorily. The CPI-M had then been in power for a little over a year. Their leaders were then dedicated, honest and law-abiding. Most of them were good people, decent and educated. They were honest and had the will to hold the reins of the administration in strong hands. Bureaucrats, too, were, by and large, upright, honest, and impartial. From today's perspective, I doubt how far such strong action, as described here, could be taken or to what extent the party in power would proceed to punish its guilty member. The administrative and political environment has been totally vitiated over the years. During my stay at Jafarganj, I also conducted a midterm general election in 1980 for the parliamentary constituency areas, falling within the subdivision, as the concerned assistant returning officer for the parliamentary constituency. Incidentally, this was the election in which Mrs. Indira Gandhi had returned to power after her defeat in the general election of 1977. My second daughter, Anasua alias Jilmil, was born here in Jafarganj in a nursing home. Born 6 years after my first daughter, she brought me a lot of pleasure. I never had any preference for a boy or a girl. My girl child was as welcome as she would have been if she were a boy. My only desire was to see my children stand on their feet, though regretfully that did not materialize. Towards the end of my tenure, Jafarganj had started showing early signs of disturbance. Initially, I had found Jafarganj peaceful and a place for tourists. But later, it started becoming disturbed by political agitation and the grooming of the Jharkhand party. Some sections of the Naxalite had also become active in the forest areas. I used to mention these happenings in my routine confidential reports to the district magistrate. The then Land and Land Reforms Minister, late Binoy Krishna Chaudhary, had visited Jafarganj for an on-the-spot assessment of the situation. During that visit, he had wanted me to stay back at Jafarganj because of the conditions prevailing there at that time. I had been transferred elsewhere in the meanwhile. As I had, by then, made all arrangements to move out and had been mentally prepared for the change, it was too late for me to rethink. At my request, the minister did not press further. Looking back, I feel it would be better for the education of my elder daughter had I agreed to stay. I left Jafarganj on September 5, 1980, on being appointed as Deputy Director of Census Operations, on deputation to Government of India. My younger daughter was then 4 months old. My successor here was Mr. Asim Barman IAS, then holding the post of SDO, Katwe. I had many good friends amongst the doctors here. One of them was a doctor and an important citizen of Jafarganj, Dr. Lalit Kumar Pahari, deceased. My younger daughter was born in his nursing home under his care and the care of his wife. Dr. Sengupta, a child specialist, and Dr. Ranjan Roy, an eye surgeon, both attached to the Jafarganj Government Hospital, and their wives were our good friends and close to us. Dr. Sengupta used to come daily to my residence to check on my younger daughter after she had been born. Once, my daughter suffered a convulsion. Both Dr. Pahari and Dr. Sengupta rushed to my residence in no time. They stayed to attend to my child till she fully recovered. My daughter was then 2 to 3 months old. Due to this, I could not attend a meeting with DLRS, Mr. D. Bandopathyay, who had come to Jafarganj to review the progress of Operation Barga. Mr. Bandopathyay had, however, appreciated the situation and did not mind my failure to attend his meeting. My university friend Bhuptosh Mandal had been a resident of Jafarganj. My family quickly got acquainted with him and his family when we came here. We often used to spend time together. As an SDO, I had a cordial relationship with my own officers and the officers of other departments posted here. To name a few, they were Kalyan Ghosh, Subdivisional Information Officer, Asim Mukherjee, Assistant Engineer PWD, Mr. Chandra, Principal of Jafarganj Polytechnic, Gaurachand Mukherjee, Subdivisional Agriculture Officer, and others. Kalyan got married while posted at Jafarganj. We all enjoyed his post-marriage party. My second officer Mr. Mridul Dasgupta was a promoted officer. He had a son and a daughter Reshmi, both of whom were bright students. He was a good man. My third officer was Mohan Lal Gupta, who hailed from Bihar. He, too, had a son and a daughter. Unfortunately, his daughter was mentally retarded. Mohan had died an unfortunate death in a road accident while posted in Kolkata. We used to have social contact with most of the officers and their families living in Jafarganj. The subdivisional police officers at my time were first B.K. Roy and then Kanai Lal Basu. From the administrative point of view, I did not have any problem with either of them. There was a cinema hall in Jaragram. I had once gone there with my wife and daughter to view a film. While the movie was running, my daughter got bitten by a rat. We had never again visited that hall nor had seen a film so long as we were in Jaragram. During my tenure in Jaragram, my elder daughter had reached the school-going age. She became restless to go to school when she found others like her walking with school bags on their shoulders. I first got her admitted to KG in Sri Ramakrishna Saradapath Girls' School, run by the female monks. Later, she was admitted to Class 1 in Rani Binod Manjari Government Girls' School. She was doing well and got deeply involved in her studies when I left on transfer. Jaragram had once been the capital town in the Kingdom of Maladevs. The town still had that beautiful royal palace, where Maladevs used to reside. Birendra Bijoy Maladev, a descendant of the Maladev dynasty, had represented the Jaragram constituency in the state assembly in the 70s and the early 80s. He belonged to the Congress party. Jaragram was a picturesque town. The roads here passed through long ranges of tall trees on both sides. The topography was undulated, running in the exotic range of Belpahari and Kankrahor to the north and bounded by the meandering Subarnarekha to the south. It had tourist spots at Hatebari and Kakrajhari, each provided with forest bungalows. At night, Jamshedpur looked like a bowl of lights from the forest bungalow at Kakrajhari. Hatebari was situated on the bank of the river Subarnarekha. The block headquarters of Gopi Ballabpur 1 at Chatinasol could be reached from Hatebari through the forest and via a village road if one wanted to avoid crossing the river Subarnarekha by boat or raft. Staying in Hatebari on a stormy night, one could hear the roars of waves in the river Subarnarekha. Sandhals, Mundas, Sabars, and Lodas were the predominant tribes in Jaragram subdivision. There was also a large section of the Mahtos living here. Besides being a tourist spot, Jaragram was also a health resort. SDO's bungalow at Jaragram was a place worth living. It had SDO's confidential office on one part of it. The bungalow was surrounded by tall sal trees. It also had cashew nut trees within its compound. The compound was big enough and held a garden of seasonal and ornamental flowers. There was vacant space within it. I had started potato cultivation in some part of it with the help of Subdivisional Agriculture Officer Gorachand Mukherjee, since deceased. Convicts lodged in Jaragram sub-jail used to be deployed to clean the premises of the SDO's office-cum-residence. Incidentally, SDOs were also the superintendents of the sub-jails in outlying subdivisions. I had worked in different capacities in the Jaragram subdivision for a total length of about 5 years and 10 months. During this period, I had wound up an office, and set up another one from scratch to a fully running state complete with all necessary requisites and concerned staff and officers in place. Regular administrative work aside, I had also handled many tricky situations and some serious law and order problems as the SDO, Jaragram. Jaragram had brought me some unforgettable moments in my personal life too, which flash in my mind at times with a sense of pleasure and fulfillment. During my later visit to Jaragram in November 2016, I found there had been worth mentioning changes in places we stayed during 1974-80. These may be enumerated below. 1. A flyover on the railway lines had come up near the Jubilee Market in Jaragram, making it easier for traffic to flow to and from the Belpahari side. 2. A compound wall had been constructed around SDO's office. The vacant area in SDO's residence had got reduced. 4. The town had expanded on all sides. 5. There had been a substantial improvement of the road to Nayagram from NH6 onward. It was now a state highway. 6 bridges had been built on the river Subarnarekha at Kudigat and at Bosragat, making Duntun, Keshiyari, Dingha, and beyond connected to Jaragram by alternative and convenient routes. These have brought great relief to the people of Gopi Ballabpur and Nayagram and have made their life easier. I joined as a Deputy Director of Census Operations at the Directorate of Census in Calcutta on September 6, 1980. Later, I was transferred to Siliguri as the Regional Deputy Director of Census Operations for the North Bengal region. I supervised the field operations of Census 1981 in close coordination with the district census officers. Census gave me an opportunity to extensively tour North Bengal, which is known for its natural beauty. In Siliguri, we stayed in a rented house belonging to one Habu Sarkar in Babupara. It was a beautiful house. The hexagonal drawing room was encircled by glass windows on all sides. Being located near a marketplace, it had the advantage of easy accessibility to daily essentials and emergency medicines, while at the same time it was peaceful. There was a cinema hall, too, nearby. The railway station was also not far off. During my entire stay in Siliguri from September 1980 to mid-1981, we stayed in this house. I had spent some memorable moments with a sense of fulfillment here. Thanks are due to my wife's nephews from her eldest sister for having arranged this house. It was during this period that I visited Darjeeling for the first time in my life. Though I had stayed close by at Meekleganj for more than 4 years, I did not have the opportunity to visit this place at that time. In the current assignment, I made several trips to Darjeeling, Kalimpong, and Kurseong, as also to other places in North Bengal for the census work. I still feel a chill down my spine when I recollect an incident that had occurred during one such trip from Darjeeling. I, along with my family, was coming down from Darjeeling via Punkabari Road and had stopped at a place, after Kurseong. We had gotten down from the car. There was a deep ravine on the offside close to the place we had stopped. My elder daughter was then 6 years old. Suddenly, to my horror, I found her on the edge of the ravine. 1 or 2 steps ahead would have taken her down to the ravine. I was a few feet away from her. I jumped and caught hold of her and somehow managed to save a catastrophe by the grace of the Almighty. I also visited Jayanti in the course of my census meeting at Alipurduyar. The village Jayanti was deep inside the forest in the Buksa Tiger Project area. It was located along the Jayanti River and presented an exquisite view of the surrounding landscapes and wild fountains. The Bhutan Hills had risen almost from the bank of the river Jayanti here. The river passed by the side of the forest bungalow where we had made a stopover. One sad side of this posting was that the education of my elder daughter suffered irrevocably. She could not get admitted to any good school in Siliguri and had to read in a neighborhood school. I could feel she was losing interest in her studies but was helpless. Her initial devotion to studies never came back. I still hold myself responsible for it. After census fieldwork was completed, I was transferred to Calcutta and placed in charge of Salt Lake Tabulation Office, set up for the tabulation of census data. The office was situated in Purta Bhawan, Salt Lake. When I was transferred from Siliguri, there was an acute shortage of government quarters in Calcutta. I did not have any chance of getting a government quarter. My friend Balachakrabarti, of whom I spoke in the early part of my service history, arranged for me private accommodation on rent at a locality called Alam Bazar near Baranagoret. It was a 2-roomed accommodation having a big room and a small one with a small kitchen on the adjacent covered veranda. The kitchen was so small that my wife had to sit in the small room and cook in the oven placed inside the so-called kitchen. The rent was 300 Indian rupees per month. Subsequently, we shifted to another rented accommodation, a better one, in a part of the ancestral house of my colleague and friend Ashok Chatterjee. It was located on Rathanbabu Road, Baranagoret, and relatively conveniently positioned. We lived there comfortably, becoming almost a part of the family, consisting of Ashok, his mother, wife, children, and a brother. Ashok's mother, Jitrimoyi Devi, was a graceful woman, strong, learned, and independent-spirited. She had accepted us lovingly. I have memories to fondly remember from the houses of both Alama Bazar and Rathanbabu Road. My elder daughter was admitted to Bethune Collegiate School. I had to escort her to the school early morning by city bus services. On returning home after leaving her at the school, I would be in a hurry to get ready for the office. I used to avail of the local train from nearby Dakshineshwar station to reach Ultadanga, from where I took a bus to attend my office at Purtha Bhawan in Salt Lake. My wife had to bring back the daughter from school, which broke at around 10 a.m. My youngest sister-in-law Shanti alias Bandana, who stayed with us at that time, took care of my younger daughter in the absence of my wife. She also looked after my needs and helped her sister with day-to-day work. She was a great help to us for long years when we had two growing up children, and I could hardly spare any time for the family. She had been a member of my family for a good many years. She was very caring and treated the children as her own. Later, I had given her in marriage from my place. Ashok, in whose paternal house we had shifted from Alambazar, had a daughter and a son. He has been a good friend of mine. He is a large-hearted person. He has helped me in many respects. When I was posted in Midnapuri for a few months, it was in his allotted quarter that I stayed with my family. He did not even allow me to pay any rent for that. He was staying elsewhere at that time. He had helped many other colleagues in the same way. He was a bachelor at that time. The quarter was in his name, but he rarely stayed there. Ashok now stays with us in his flat in the same cooperative building. When working as the in charge of the Salt Lake Census Tabulation Office, I found some actions of the Director of Census Operations, under whom I was working, dishonorable from the point of administrative proprieties and questioned them. It appeared to me that the director had started seeing through the airs. He remained encircled by sycophants, who had been influencing his judgment about other officers. Some of his observations and actions were hurting my dignity. He had even sent an officer junior to me to oversee the progress of work in my office. As per the administrative principles, no junior officer can evaluate the work of an officer senior to him. I met the director, pointed out how his actions were hurting my dignity, and proceeded on long leave. On the expiry of the leave, I joined the office and then relinquished the charge of it the same day, March 31, 1982, to take up my new assignment as Deputy Director of Small Scale Industries. I may mention here that I had served under the very officer, who had then been holding the post of the Director of Census Operations, in his earlier assignment, as the District Magistrate, Midnapuri. It was he who had selected me for the census post after having seen me working for about 2 years. I feel the officers, at least some of them, who used to keep the director company, had been instrumental in creating a poor impression of me. I preferred to stay in my workplace doing my duty rather than go elsewhere to keep others in good humor. Unable to get me to their fold, a section of officers might have joined hands in a whispering campaign against me. My next appointment was as the managing director for 2 upcoming spinning mills in the cooperative sector. The mills were the Kangsabati Cooperative Spinning Mills Limited to be set up at Barjara, Bankura, and the Tamralipta Cooperative Spinning Mills Limited to be set up at Midnapuri, both with headquarters in Calcutta. After spending a little over 4 months as Deputy Director of Industries, Employment, in the Cottage and Small Scale Industries Directorate, I joined my post as Managing Director, Spinning Mills on the 6th of August 1982. Both the mills were then, so to say, at an embryo stage. Administration of the mills prior to my joining. There was a joint administrative office with 1 re-employed officer of the Handloom Directorate as administrative officer and a couple of staff on deputation. The office used to sit in a small cubicle within the premise of another government office in Calcutta. The Director of Handloom and Textile was the chairman of the managing committee for both the mills. The committees consisted of the members nominated by the state government. Setting up of office. My first task was to find an office accommodation and the staff for the office. To appoint staff, names of eligible candidates were obtained from the employment exchange, and the selection was made by an interview. Those appointed turned out to be good workers, sincere and hard-working. Meanwhile, I hired accommodation for the office and appointed a chartered accountant for accounts on a part-time basis. The chartered accountant was an honest man. I did not have to worry much about the accounts matters. After the office had started functioning, I also purchased a jeep for the project site for efficient supervision and coordination with local authorities. Cost of the project and financial arrangement. The project cost for each mill was around 801 Indian rupees lakhs as per the original estimates. The state government was to provide 50% of the cost in the form of equity participation. Of the balance, a part would come as soft loans from NCDC, National Cooperative Development Corporation, and the rest as term loan from a consortium of IDBI, IFCI and ISSI. Later, a scheme for bringing water to the mills from off-site sources was sanctioned by the state government at an initial cost of 27 Indian rupees lakhs. This amount was not to be a part of the project cost and was to be financed entirely by the state government. The availability of water, an essential item for running a spilling mill, was not looked into at the time of formulation of the project. Land takeover and review of supervision arrangement. After setting up the office, I proceeded to take over the lands, selected prior to my joining, for the mills at Beerhampori and Midnapuri. The architect for designing the structures and overseeing the construction work was also appointed before my joining. I felt it was not prudent to rely solely on a private architect in such voluminous construction activities. I considered having some senior engineers on deputation from the government for proper and effective supervision. Arrangement for supervision of construction activities. Accordingly, a post of an executive engineer for the two societies to supervise and monitor the construction activities was created. Later, I got an executive engineer on deputation from the state PWD to man the post. To my good fortune, he was a very honest man. I also got a post of an assistant engineer created for each of the mills and had two assistant engineers on deputation from the government against these posts for day-to-day supervision of the civil construction work. The assistant engineers worked under the supervision and control of the executive engineer. Cart before the horse, machineries ordered before land in possession. The orders for the spinning machines with capacities of 50,000 spindles, for each of the mills, 2, had been placed with Texmaco before I had joined. The company was also paid a part of the cost of machinery in confirmation of the order. I did not find any reason for such a hurried action in placing the orders for the machines when there was no infrastructure to install them, even the land was not in possession, and there was nothing to be gained by way of discount or price protection for early placement of the orders. Company's proposal to deliver machines prematurely. This supplier company later, when I was in charge of the project, came with a proposal for delivering the machines. This proposal, if accepted, would require mills to pay the entire balance cost of the machines. The civil work at the site had then just started. It had a long way to go before the building was ready for the installation of the machines. The company had offered to keep the machines in custody after the delivery until buildings were ready for the installation. The company's proposal came to me through the then chairman of the societies. There was nothing in the proposal for the mills but everything for the supplier company. It was a design by the supplier to secure the full payment of the cost of the machines. I strongly opposed the proposal in consideration of various factors that would go against the interests of the mills and placed the matter with my reasons and views to the chairman. An attempt to bribe to get things done. One morning, after my views on the company's above proposal was known, a couple of senior officers of the supplier company met me in my office for a discussion on the matter. When I told them that there was nothing further to discuss, they tacitly offered to sponsor a visit for myself and my family in any state of my choice. The offer was contemptuously rejected. The proposal of the company did not find its approval. A major omission in project formulation. After taking over possession of the lands, when I got ready for the initiation of the civil construction work, it came to my knowledge that there was a cardinal constraint for both the mills. Water required for the production was not available at the sites. It was indispensably required to make separate arrangements for water if the mills were to be set up. I immediately brought the matter to the knowledge of the government. The government decided to have separate schemes to get water by pipelines from the river Damodar at Durgapur through a distance of 12 kilometers to the mill site at Borhora, and from the river Kangsabati through a distance of half to 1 kilometer to the mill site at Midnapuri. The Public Health Engineering Department of the government was entrusted with the planning and execution of the scheme. The cost of these schemes would be borne by the state government from its budget and would not form a part of the project cost. The state government would also have to bear considerable recurring expenses to run and maintain these pipelines once they became operational. This is a classic example of an ill-conceived project burdening the exchequer with additional funds for its survival. When selecting the site, nobody had taken care to see if the sites had the basic requirements for running the mills. As far as I remember, the initial estimated cost for the pipeline scheme was 27 Indian rupees lakhs. IFCA and NCDC. There was an apex body of cooperative spinning mills named All India Federation of Cooperative Spinning Mills Limited, IFCA, located in Mumbai. The federation had experts who helped the spinning mills authorities in the preparation of the project report, selection of machinery, and the appraisal of the project by the financial institutions, on payment of consultancy charges. Our spinning mills, too, were the members of this body. The services of the apex body were utilized for the preparation of the project reports, selection of machinery, appraisal of the project, etc., for our two mills, too. I was surprised that this expert body, associated with the preparation of the project report, did not also mention anything about the absence of water at the sites. Probably they did not visit the site, which they should have, to examine the feasibility of the project. Anyway, I had visited the Federation office in Mumbai once with my chairman in connection with the affairs of the mills, and to attend the AGM of the Federation. I had also visited NCDC, National Cooperative Development Corporation, headquartered in Delhi, in connection with the sanction of NCDC loan for the mills. The loans were sanctioned before my departure from the project. Functions as Managing Director. My activities during my tenure as Managing Director here may be stated in a nutshell as 1. Setting up infrastructural facilities, like an office with supporting staff and officers, making arrangements for land and water for the mills, etc., to start with. 2. Negotiations with all India financial institutions viz., IDBI, IFCI, ICICI for term loan arrangement and the appraisal of the project by these institutions for the purpose. 3. Finalization of contracts for civil/electrical work, humidification plants, and textile machinery, the initial part of the last one done before my joining. 4. Overall supervision of construction activities and 5. Exercising administrative and financial control as the chief executive. It was a special kind of multifaceted project, which very few middle-level civil servants would have the opportunity to head. I could enrich my knowledge to a great extent by working as the head of this project at its implementation stage. I headed the project for more than 4 years and had involvement in every aspect of this project. Departure. I left these organizations on March 2, 1987, to join my new post of Deputy Secretary to the Government of West Bengal in the Commerce and Industries Department. The construction work of the factory was then in an advanced stage, and the appraisal of the project by the financial institutions was complete. The government flat I stayed in for most of my service life in Calcutta. I had so long been working from my rented house at Baranagoret. On December 4, 1982, when I was working in the spinning mills, I got an allotment of a government flat in a newly constructed housing complex named Minto Park Government Housing Estate, at 247/1 Lower Circular Road. It was due to a senior colleague of mine, Mr. Kijendranath Bhaumik, that I could get this allotment. Mr. Bhaumik was the Deputy Secretary of the Housing Department and dealt with the allotments of flats to the government officers. My sincerest gratitude goes to Mr. Bhaumik. The flat was in a multi-storied building in a posh locale. It was on the 6th floor overseeing the racecourse and the Victoria Memorial. Numbered 68, it was well ventilated and open to a beautiful landscape. We moved to this flat on January 14, 1983, and stayed there till June 1, 1997, when we shifted to our own flat in the cooperative housing estate in Salt Lake. My mother had died here after a brief illness due to a fractured femur. The memory of my stay here brings me both pain and pleasure. It was here I had met with the most unwarranted situation in my life brought about by an ADC to the governor in his attempt to trespass on my house. I have described it in detail on the page of my Raj Bhawan posting. It was, here again, I had lost something precious, the memory of which I still cherish deeply in my heart. I had got and refused my first-time promotion to the IAS from here. I had also joined the IAS after refusing the promotion twice earlier when here, the early part of my service in the IAS again was attended to from here only. My younger daughter had suffered a severe gastroenteric attack requiring hospitalization when we were here. My eldest maternal uncle, Baramama, now deceased, and his daughters came from Bangladesh to visit us here. His younger brother, my Kutumama, too, came from Silchar with his daughters to visit us here. My cousin Daipu came from Bangladesh with his newly married wife Chuma when we were here. Again, it is from here I had given my youngest sister-in-law, who had formed a part of my family for a pretty long time, in marriage. It was again from here my younger daughter had started her school life. This house, therefore, shares many of the memories of my Calcutta life. I joined as a deputy secretary in the Department of Commerce and Industries at Writers Buildings on March 2, 1987. I worked in this department for a little less than 3 years. Duties and responsibilities. I looked after that branch of the department which dealt with mines and minerals. I was, as such, associated with the framing of the state policy on mines and minerals as also with the administration of the acts and rules on these matters. The Directorate of Mines and Minerals, and the West Bengal Mineral Development Corporation were under the administrative control of this branch. The branch also dealt with the matters of coal mines insofar as those related to the state government applications for the grant of lease of the areas for extraction of minor minerals like sand, gravel, boulder, earth, etc., and for prospecting licenses for major minerals used to be processed in this branch, and lease/license was issued from here. During my tenure here, I had also held the additional charge of West Bengal Sugar Industries Corporation as its managing director for some time. Field visit. While posted here, I visited some of the districts rich in minor minerals for having first-hand knowledge of the field's situation. During these tours, I also had discussions with field-level officers on matters to be looked into before recommending an application for lease/licenses on minor minerals. Matters related to preventive actions against lifting sand from the restricted areas within the statutory distance of the bridges and the highways were also discussed. A noteworthy matter and lessons from it. Here I recount a matter where a government decision rejecting an application for renewal of a lease was upheld by the successive courts of law when the applicant brought it before them. I had examined the matter with due attention to existing laws in the following order. A son of the holder of a lease for sand in the district of Hooghly applied for the renewal of the lease held by his father. While processing the application for renewal of the lease, it transpired that the leaseholder was dead, and the validity of the lease had also expired. My view was that the application was liable to be rejected on the ground that the holder of the lease being already dead, there could not be a renewal of the lease in his favor. I was also of the view that the lease having already expired and being non-existent at the time, there was no property under it, that the descendants of the deceased could claim for transfer in their favor. I had a feeling that the applicant would go to court. A speaking order was passed giving reasons and quoting appropriate sections of the law, including relevant provisions in the Transfer of Property Act. The applicant had first moved a writ petition in a single bench of the Calcutta High Court, where he had lost. He then had appealed to the division bench where, too, he had failed, and the matter rested there, as far as I know. This example is cited to show that in certain administrative matters, judicial intervention could be avoided if such matters are disposed of with proper application of mind and adequate reasoning. The government faces many cases under Art 226 of the Constitution for default in proper disposal of matters brought before it by the aggrieved parties. My findings in WB Sugar Industries Corporation. During my tenure in this department, I was placed in an additional charge of the Sugar Industries Corporation having its mills at Ahmedpur, Beerhampori, as its managing director. This was done with my consent to man the post when the departmental secretary decided to replace the incumbent managing director of the corporation. Departmental Secretary, Mr. P.K. Sarkar was an upright officer. In deference to his wishes, I took up this assignment. I joined on August 10, 1989 and worked there up to December 30 that year. When working there, I found various irregularities in the affairs of the corporation. The mills had to make substantial purchases over the year for their functioning. There was no purchase policy. The procedure followed in purchase matters was not transparent and not supported by established norms. It smacked of corrupt practices. It was not possible to bring about any major change in the system without disturbing the operation of the mills in the available time before the sugarcane crushing season. Steps were, however, taken for correction, wherever possible. I also identified some of the people involved and sent the principal officer, purchase officer, primarily responsible for the irregularities on leave. I felt there were others, too, above the purchase officer involved, but the paucity of time and the scope of duty did not allow me to proceed further. I, however, kept the department informed. During my short stay, I tried to set the system in order and plug its loopholes to the extent possible. Deployment for the conduct of the election. I was detailed to assist the district magistrate, Bird 1, in conducting the election to the Legislative Assembly in the Asansol subdivision immediately after I had joined this department. I had camped in Asansol till the election was completed. Mr. Satish Tiwari, a young IAS officer, was the SDO, Asansol, at that time. Preparation and polling station-wise splitting of the electoral rolls, in particular, was in a mess apart from other lacunae for the smooth conduct of election when we had arrived. We had worked hard to get matters under control, the election had concluded smoothly. We had the full cooperation of local officers and the district authorities. Departure from C&I Department. I left Commerce and Industries Department on January 1, 1990, to join as the Deputy Secretary to the Governor. The incumbent Governor, Mr. T.V. Rajswar, had selected me after interviewing me and another colleague. I joined a combination of posts viz., Deputy Secretary to the Governor, Director of Hospitality and the Controller, Governor's Household in Calcutta Raj Bhawan on January 1, 1990, in the afternoon. A New Year party hosted by Governor T.V. Rajswar was in progress when I came to take up my assignment. The guests included dignitaries from the film and the cultural world. The party was nearing its end when I had arrived, and guests were leaving. I met there a few noted personalities of films, sports, and cultural fields. Amongst them were Basanta Chaudhary, Debasri Roy, Aparna Sen, P.K. Banerjee, and some others of whom I no longer remember the names. V. Administrative setup. The governor's establishment headed by the secretary to the governor had two wings. In one wing was the governor's secretariat to look after constitutional and related matters as also the daily local engagements of the governor. In the other wing, was the DSGS-1 office, formerly known as the Military Secretary's Office, to look after household affairs and protocol matters. This wing was later named Governor's Household Secretariat, but I was no longer there when it happened. There were section officers, office superintendent, transport superintendent, household assistants, accountant, cashier, librarian, and others besides a large contingent of Group D staff attached to this office. During my tenure, one post of housekeeper was created, and a woman was appointed against it. There were also aides de camp, as DC, to the governor, one from the army and another from the navy, born in the DSG's establishment. The government of India in the Defence Ministry later declined to spare two officers from the defence services for the posts of as DC, aides de camp. It was then decided that one post of ADC would be manned by an IPS officer from the state government. This arrangement, however, came into effect after I had left. Cars, availability and management. Raj Bhawan had a fleet of cars, including a limousine for the governor and a Contessa for the official hostess. During my tenure, we replaced an old unserviceable car with a Maruti Suzuki Safari. The transport superintendent, an officer of the rank of section officer, was in immediate charge of these cars. Besides official use, these cars, except the ones used by the governor and the official hostess, could be used by senior officials of Raj Bhawan and the aides de camp for personal purposes free of cost up to a certain fixed KMS per month, and at discounted charges beyond that fixed limit. Building maintenance and construction. As for the maintenance and the construction work in Raj Bhawan, there were one executive engineer and two assistant engineers, civil and electrical, with separate offices. These officers were on deputation from the PWD of the Government of West Bengal. Gardening. There was a garden superintendent for the upkeep of the garden inside Raj Bhawan. The garden superintendent was an official from the Forest Department. Raj Bhawan Press. Raj Bhawan had a printing press for printing urgent and confidential matters. Accommodation for staff and officers. All the senior officers, the SDC, and the household staff had quarters in the Raj Bhawan complex. Quarters of the secretary and the deputy secretary were in duplex-type bungalows. The one meant for the deputy secretary had developed cracks on the walls and the ceiling over the years and needed extensive repairs. I did not occupy it. I stayed in a flat in a nearby government residential complex and preferred not to change it. The governor had permitted me to continue from the residence I had hitherto been living in. It was mandatory for the secretary and the deputy secretary to stay in their earmarked official quarters in Raj Bhawan. Telephone arrangement. Telephone connections were provided to every official of Raj Bhawan at the office and the residence. Every room and service point, too, in the Raj Bhawan complex was connected by telephones. To accomplish this, there was a well-maintained network of extension lines. Raj Bhawan's own operators used to serve this large number of extension telephones through a manual PBX board. I got the manual PBX replaced by an electronic board at the cost of 5 Indian rupees lakhs. The changeover increased the efficiency of the system and reduced the workload on the operators. A supervisor of the Calcutta telephones remained posted at Raj Bhawan to oversee the maintenance of the telephone systems in Raj Bhawan. Healthcare for governor. A full-time resident physician remained posted in Raj Bhawan to take care of governor's health needs. The renowned homeopath Dr. Badhyanath Chakrabarty, since deceased, was an honorary physician to the governor. He used to attend to Raj Bhawan officials, too, free of cost on certain specific dates. Professor Hassan, the governor, did not keep good health and was under regular medical attendance. The resident physician usually attended him. But when needed, senior government medical officers and the specialists also attended to him. Besides, he visited the USA at least once a year for his treatment. On a couple of occasions, he fell sick on the way back from tours and had to be rushed to the hospital straight from the airport. Duties and responsibilities as Deputy Secretary to Governor. As Deputy Secretary to the Governor, I was in charge of the Governor's household. All resources of the Governor's household in men and materials, excluding staff and officials of the Governor's Secretariat, were at my disposal subject to the overall superintendence of the Secretary. I had to look after the welfare of the Governor and his guests and arrange for the accommodation of the VVIPs and the Governor's guests in Raj Bhawan. It fell in my duty to oversee arrangements for parties hosted by the Governor in honor of the visiting dignitaries or the local who's who. I had to finalize the seating arrangements in such dinner and lunch parties, according to protocol, subject to the approval of the Governor. I had to prepare the guest list and the menu on the advice of the Governor and get the acknowledgements of the invitations sent. My responsibility included the making of the arrangements of tours of the governor and his party, by plane, train, or helicopter within or outside the state or the country. I had to accompany the governor sometimes during his official tours in the absence of the secretary. I was also responsible for organizing governors' camps at Darjeeling and the movement of all men and materials there for the purpose. I was the administrative head of the office of DSG and had to discharge all administrative functions as such head. Duties and responsibilities as Director of Hospitality. As the Director of Hospitality, I had to look after the state guests accommodated in Raj Bhawan. I also remained associated with the arrangements for the state functions, example swearing-in ceremonies of the ministers and the governor at Raj Bhawan, as also, the state receptions on Independence Day and the Republic Day. Invitations for the Independence Day and the Republic Day receptions were usually issued in the names of the governor and his wife. Governor and his wife or official hostess, where governor had no wife, personally met the guests on these occasions and chit-chat with them. Chief Minister also invariably attended these state functions. These were the occasions for the participants, who were senior civil and military officers and important citizens representing various sections of the society, to have interactions. The guests were entertained with tea, coffee, sweets, and snacks. At the beginning and the end of the reception, an army band played the national anthem. The freedom fighters were, in particular, invited to Independence Day receptions. The events were organized by the Household Office of the Governor and conducted under the supervision of the Deputy Secretary to the Governor. The police controlled the entry, the exit, and the movement of traffic in and out of Raj Bhawan. They also regulated the parking of cars inside the Raj Bhawan complex. Duties and responsibilities as Controller of Governor's Household. As the Controller of the Governor's Household, I was responsible for proper accounting of the expenses in the household. I had also to remain associated with the audit of the expenditure incurred under the Governor's Emoluments, Allowances, and Privileges, Act 1982 and the rules made thereunder. Expenditure was charged directly to the Consolidated Fund and did not require the approval of the legislature. An audit of the expenditure in the governor's household was conducted under the direct supervision of an officer of the rank of Deputy Accountant General. Repercussion to changes I brought about in household affairs. There were unwarranted and unwelcome repercussions to changes I had brought about to streamline administration in governor's household affairs. As the Deputy Secretary in charge of the governor's household, I had made some changes in the management of its affairs to set right certain matters and had put in place some procedural requirements to enforce financial regulations and increase efficiency. In the process, I had also discontinued certain age-old practices, which were at variance with the financial rules and regulations of the government. I need not go into the specifics and the details. As it appeared from later developments, these steps had made some people in positions in Raj Bhawan unhappy and had, if my assessment was not largely incorrect, acted as the root cause for a number of deplorable incidents later, culminating in a couple of criminal acts. I have described these acts and incidents in detail in later paragraphs. Keeping in view the high esteem in which the institution of the governor was held in the public eye, I had played down those incidents at the time of their happenings and had refused to give interviews to the newspaper reporters, some of whom had approached me after the incidents. I shall, however, be guilty of suppressing the truth if I exclude from my life story these reprehensible episodes caused by people working with the head of a state. I have, therefore, included a vivid description of those deplorable incidents towards the end of this chapter. Before I reach there, I must make it known that there was no action against the offender, from any end in spite of people at the top echelon of the state administration being fully aware of the matters. I had to go on leave in an unusual situation and had joined a new assignment on the expiry of that leave. The proposal for my posting out of Raj Bhawan was, however, under consideration of the government for some time earlier to incidents in Raj Bhawan. I may also add that I was to go on leave for 57 days from January 4, 1992, much before the incidents referred to above had happened, but had to postpone it at the last minute at the request of the secretary and the desire of the governor in consideration of inconveniences it was likely to cause to Rajbhawan administration. I was not happy with the working environment in Rajbhawan at that time with the then secretary, who I had found incapable of taking a correct stand if he had a reason to believe that would displease the governor, at the helm of affairs. I had, therefore, decided to go on long leave with the intent of not returning to the post. But I could not disoblige the governor and had to postpone the leave at the last moment at his desire. Governors I had served under in Rajbhawan. While in Rajbhawan, I had the opportunity of working with several governors. First, it was Mr. T.V. Rajswar who had brought me to Rajbhawan. His stay after my joining, however, was very short. He had completed his term and left. Mr. Rajswar had replaced British names of the suites in Rajbhawan, e.g. Prince of Wales, Anderson, Wellesley, etc., with the names of the great rivers of India, e.g., Ganga, Jamuna, Brahmaputra, etc. Later, his successor, Professor S. Nurul Hasan, reverted these suites to their old British names in keeping with their historical legacy. By and large, Mr. Rajswar was a good administrator. Sri Rajswar was the governor of West Bengal from March 20, 1989 to February 7, 1990. He died on January 14, 2018. He had also served as Lieutenant Governor in Arunachal Pradesh, Governor of Sikkim, and finally, Governor of Uttar Pradesh. Sri Rajswar was originally a member of the Indian Police Service and had served as Intelligence Bureau Chief before becoming the Lieutenant Governor of Arunachal Pradesh in 1983. He was awarded the Padma Vibhushan in 2012. The next was Professor S. Nurul Hasan, who, on the completion of his term as the Governor of Orissa, took over as the Governor of West Bengal. With him came his sister S. Rizwanul Hasan, whom we used to call Baiji, meaning sister. She was the official hostess of the governor. Professor Hasan was a widower. He had a son who had been a professor of astrophysics and a daughter, who ran a business in the USA. Professor Hasan was a great scholar. He brought with him 2 truckloads of books, for the upkeeping of which, special arrangements had to be made in Rajbhawan. He used to hold monthly meetings with the Chief Secretary, the Home Secretary, and the Director General of Police to appraise himself of the law and order situations in the state. Whenever there would be any incident involving the minority community, he would either talk to or call for an immediate report from the Chief Secretary. Professor Hasan, due to his various ailments, had restrictions on the food he could take. But he loved to entertain people and often invited important personalities to lunch or dinner. He dictated the menu himself. He also had a personal cook named Yaqub who could prepare special dishes. Yaqub could make excellent dishes of biryani, smoked hilsa, fried tiger prawns, etc. Professor Hasan died on July 12, 1993, while in office, at the SSKM Hospital, Calcutta. I was then posted as the Deputy Secretary in the Urban Development Department. Professor Hasan had served as Governor of West Bengal from August 12, 1986 to March 20, 1989 for the first term and then from February 7, 1990 till his death on July 12, 1993 for another term. Professor Syed Nurul Hasan, December 26, 1921 to July 12, 1993, was an Indian historian and an elder statesman in the Government of India. A member of the Rajya Sabha, he was the Union Minister of State, with independent charges, of education, social welfare and culture in the Government of India, 1971 to 1977. He was an Indian ambassador in USSR, 1983 to 1986, before he was assigned to governorship. He was a learned man. During the period Professor Hasan remained outside the country for his treatment, the governors of the adjoining states held the additional charge of the governor of the state. Once, it was A.R. Kidwai from Bihar, and another time, it was K. Raghunatha Reddy from Tripura, who had held such additional charge. Mr. Reddy had stayed in Calcutta Rajbhawan for the entire period for which he had been in the additional charge of the state. I had accompanied him and Mrs. Reddy to Agratla on their way back. I had then stayed in Agratla Rajbhawan for a couple of days as a guest of the governor. Mrs. Reddy used to cook some food items herself. She was a hospitable woman. During my stay in Agratla Rajbhawan, she used to call the governor and me together to have food and served the food by herself. Mrs. Reddy was a motherly woman. She was a doctor by profession and used to attend to the poor people free of cost in Agratla. She had presented me with a table lamp in the shape of a peacock made of bamboo. It has lost its luster being weather-bitten over the years. Artisans in Tripura were known for their aptitude in bamboo work. The bamboo-made peacock was a display of their craftsmanship. Both Mrs. and Mr. Reddy, according to my understanding, were very good people, warm, religious, and conservative. They had a son in Delhi who was a prominent doctor. After Professor S. Nurul Hasan had died, Sri Reddy served as the full-fledged governor of West Bengal during the period from August 14, 1993, to April 27, 1998. He died on March 4, 2002. K. V. Raghunatha Reddy, September 4, 1924, March 4, 2002, was a politician. He served as a member of Rajya Sabha from Andhra Pradesh for the 3 terms of 1962 to 68, 1968 to 74, and 1974 to 1980. Meeting personalities of national and international repute. During my tenure in Calcutta Rajbhawan, I had the privilege of meeting many national and international dignitaries. Amongst them were President R. Venkatraman, Prime Minister V.P. Singh and his wife Sita Devi, Prime Minister Chandrasekhar, H.E. Nelson Mandela, H.E. Yasser Arafat. I also had the opportunity to see Suhad Tal, who had later married Palestinian President Yasser Arafat and who had come as secretary to Arafat during the latter's visit to India in 1990-91, President of Cambodia, Mr. Hun Sen, Mayor of London, and others. About Darjeeling Rajbhawan and Governor's Camp there. Darjeeling also had Rajbhawan, where the governor spent a part of the summer and a few pre-winter days. Darjeeling Rajbhawan had a guest house, the secretary's quarters, the deputy secretary's quarters, and the staff quarters within its complex. During the period the governor camped in Darjeeling, most of the officers and the staff members of Calcutta Rajbhawan had to be there. It was the duty of the deputy secretary to organize the movement of this huge number of men, and the required materials, including Rajbhawan cars to and from Darjeeling. As the concerned deputy secretary, I was also to remain personally present in Darjeeling at that time to oversee household matters. During the period the governor camped at Darjeeling, the postal department used to collect daily a mailbag from Calcutta Rajbhawan and deliver it at Darjeeling Rajbhawan and vice versa. News of PM Rajiv Gandhi's assassination comes to the governor in Darjeeling. It was during the 1991 summer camp of the governor in Darjeeling that Prime Minister Rajiv Gandhi was assassinated in Sriperumbudur. On May 21 that year, when I was in Darjeeling in Governor's summer camp, I received a telephone call at the dead of night from our staff in Calcutta Rajbhawan giving the fateful message that Prime Minister Rajiv Gandhi had been assassinated. The message had to be communicated immediately to the governor. The governor was woken up from sleep to convey the message. The governor had left for Delhi early next morning. He had returned after the funeral of the late Prime Minister had been over. More about 1991 summer camp. In that Darjeeling tour of 1991, I had taken my family along. We flew from Calcutta by a government helicopter on its trial flight for taking the governor from Bagdogra the next day. We took off from Barrackpur airstrip and landed near Mel in Darjeeling with stopovers at Malda and Bagdogra. During the 1991 Darjeeling tour, we had once visited the nearby tourist spot at Mirak. Before that year's summer camp had ended, a pleasure trip for the Rajbhawan personnel and their families from Darjeeling to Batavia Loop 4 by toy train was arranged as desired by the governor. Governor himself had also accompanied. We had the entire train at our disposal. Mother's death, Sep 16, 1990. When working in Rajbhawan, I had lost my mother on September 16, 1990. She had been staying with me in Calcutta at that time. But, by my ill luck, I could not be by her side when she breathed her last. I had gone to Darjeeling to supervise the arrangements for the governor's upcoming pre-winter visit. I had received the message of her death on the train through railway's internal messaging system on my way back and performed her funeral the next day on my return. Her body was kept in the mortuary, peace heaven, till I could arrange the funeral. The funeral took place at Nimtala Crematorium, Calcutta. It had not become Kolkata till then. My mother had been ailing for some time after her femur fractured from a minor fall in trying to reach a light switch in her room. She was treated for a few days in the Woodburn ward of SSKM Hospital. When the doctors declared that there was no chance of her recovery, she was brought back home and kept under the care of my wife and of a physician friend, who had been a co-resident in our housing estate. At the final stage of her life, my mother had been in a coma for a few days before her death. She had also developed bed sores. At that stage, my wife had fed her through Ryle's tube, cleaned her and changed her clothes. She had nursed her with love and care. She had even cleansed her faces ungrudgingly. She could not do these if she did not have genuine compassion in her heart. My wife was simple, social, had forbearance, and lots of patience, too. When my mother died, I had been away. My wife had done everything for her, including keeping the body in the mortuary with the assistance of the neighbors and the staff members of Rajbhawan administration, where I had been working at that time. Governor's condolence. The governor was in Delhi at the time my mother had died. He sent a condolence message from there. Governor's sister Baiji attended mother's Shraddh ceremony held 12 days after mother's death, in my flat at the Minto Park Government Housing Estate, where I had been living then. President of India's visit. During my tenure in Rajbhawan, President R. Venkatraman visited Calcutta more than once. There used to be a large entourage that comprised of his family members and the officials of the President's office. Once, the President had visited Darjeeling, when Governor had been camping there. Executive Engineer, Rajbhawan, who did not usually stay in Darjeeling during Governor's camp, had to be called for in connection with the President's visit. The gentleman had been in trouble finding a particular type of bathroom flash Mrs. Venkatraman had wanted to be fixed in the bathroom she was using in Rajbhawan. That had put the executive engineer in a fix, as such flash was not locally available. However, he ultimately managed to procure one and save the situation. Power failure in Rajbhawan and subsequent developments. Once in 1991, Sri T. N. Seshan, the then Chief Election Commissioner of India, was staying in Rajbhawan while on a visit to the state. A group of celebrities led by the noted film actor-director, Ms. Aparna Sen, was waiting in the yellow drawing room 5 of Rajbhawan to meet Mr. Seshan for a discussion on matters relating to the upcoming election. Mr. Seshan was with the governor. Suddenly, the lights went out. This was a singular instance of power failure in Rajbhawan during the 2 years I had been here. Rajbhawan used to be fed by 3 separate grids for the transmission of electricity. If there were a failure in any of the grids, one or the other 2 grids took over. The need for any captive generator was, therefore, not felt. Unfortunately, all 3 grids failed at a time on that particular occasion. That power failure had lasted for about half an hour. Ms. Aparna Sen started feeling unwell and was taken outside in the open air. Later, when I was escorting Mr. Seshan to his room in Rajbhawan, he asked me if there was no generator in Rajbhawan. I apprised him of the factual position. After this incident of power failure, it was decided to install 2 high-capacity captive generators. These generators were installed during my tenure here. Aides-de-camp to governor and problem with them. I found it a difficult task to deal with the aides-de-camp to the governor in Rajbhawan. It was because of the secretary, the officer to control them, being unable to exert himself. Being the closest to the governor and remaining, as it were, as his shadow, these aides-de-camp felt that they were under no one's control and could do whatever they wanted, disregarding established rules and procedures. As I started enforcing rules and putting in place the procedural requirements, as stated earlier, they felt the pinch and began creating problems, one after another, sometimes leading almost to a crisis. The situation worsened after a new officer from the Navy had joined. He was rude and indecent in behavior. The attitude and behavior of the SDC created bad blood in the official circles. Starting from demanding a separate typist, to which no officer was entitled, and time-to-time inspection of their residences by the household staff for proper upkeep, one of them even went to the extent of refusing to submit vouchers for expenditure incurred by him out of the cash provided as advance, for use in exigencies during the governor's tour. Another of them wanted that the officials of the DSG's office should take orders directly from him in utter disregard to the administrative rules and regulations, as DC were, as such, no part of the office administration. These facts were, from time to time, brought to the knowledge of the secretary, who was the administrative head of the governor's establishment as a whole, besides being the controlling officer of the aides-de-camp, as DC. The secretary to the governor failed to take appropriate action to bring home to the SDC that they would have to work according to the established rules and regulations and could not do as they wished. In the absence of any deterrent action, the SDC became bolder and went beyond all norms of civility. A criminal act by Army ADC, January 3, 1992, unprecedented. On the January 3, 1992, the Army ADC threatened and intimidated a section officer of the Household Office, Nirmal Chatterjee, in his office chamber during office hours for rightly refusing to take orders directly from him. It created a crisis with the staff, threatening to go on strike. This incident also came as a news item in the Telegraph of the January 5, 1992. There was no action administrative or otherwise against the ADC even after this. I had worked with senior officers of the Army of the rank of Major much earlier in my service life. They were quiet, decent, accommodative, and likable personalities. I could never think that junior officers of the service could behave in the manner they did in Raj Bhawan. The indulgence they got and the leniency they were treated with here might have prompted these young officers of the defense services to act in the way they did. While appreciating the hard way they live in the field situation and the sacrifices they make for the country, I am constrained to observe that they lack the training to conduct themselves in a civil administration. A second offense, more serious, by Navy ADC. January 22, 1992. In the absence of any action against the SDC by the higher authorities, these SDC became encouraged to be more aggressive. Finally, the Navy ADC lost all his balance and, taking advantage of the governor's absence from the headquarters, transgressed to my residence, to settle scores with me, at the personal level on the successive nights of January the 22nd and the 23rd, 1992. On the 22nd night, he came at around 11 p.m. in a fully drunken state and pushed the buzzer of my flat persistently. As I opened the door, he started shouting at me, hurling all sorts of abuses, including American slang. He was, at the same time, pounding on my open door with all his might. He raised a false allegation that under my orders, a Raj Bhawan car was not allotted to him for an emergency involving his pregnant wife. I was dumbfounded, I didn't know anything about it. I told him I had no knowledge of things he was saying. He was not in a state to see reasons. He continued abusing me and left at around 11:15 p.m. saying, "I don't care what happens to me, but I shall see you." At the uproar created by the ADC at my doorstep, residents of other flats in the building, including some senior IPS officers, came out of their respective flats. He thus disturbed the peace and tranquility of not only my family but also of a good number of my co-residents, for which, too, he was answerable. Even if the concocted story of the ADC involving his wife were true, The ADC would not have been within his right to take his wrath to the residence of any officer, senior or junior. He had the rightful option to take the matter to the superior authority. What he did instead amounted to the criminal act of trespassing, intimidation, and threat to life, for which he was punishable, under appropriate sections of the Indian Penal Code. But my FIR was not taken to record at the instance of those who mattered. Law remained a mute spectator while the culprit had a field day. It came in a news item at the time that the Home Secretary had denied any FIR had been lodged. He, though fully aware of the facts, did not take any action for initiating even a departmental inquiry. It may be mentioned here that I had earlier insisted on his submission of a voucher relating to an expense made by the said ADC out of the government cash advanced to him during one of Governor's Delhi trips sometimes before these incidents. In the absence of the voucher, the advance paid could not be adjusted as required by the financial rules. All the efforts to get the voucher having failed, I referred it to the Secretary for enforcing compliance by the ADC. On a different occasion, the same ADC had almost created a crisis involving an officiating governor's visit to Delhi. I had written a strongly worded confidential DO letter to the Secretary on that occasion, highlighting the undesirable activity of the ADC and seeking appropriate action. I feel said demi-official letter was either shown to him, or he had somehow got access to it. These actions involving him might have made him mad and led him to cause these criminal acts. Higher authorities failed to take action. I had reported the incident of January 22 to the Secretary the very next day, requesting him to take appropriate action in the matter. I had requested him to get security guards posted at my residence for the safety and security of my family against the threat hurled by the ADC. Copies of this letter were forwarded to the Chief Secretary, CS, and the Home Secretary, HS, of the Government of West Bengal for necessary action. I had personally delivered these copies at the respective offices of the HS and the CS. But no action was taken, no guards were posted. Repetition of offense by Navy ADC, January 23, 1992. The next night, January 23, 1992, we started receiving threat calls from the associates of the ADC, claiming to be from Navy House. One such call was received by a telephone operator of Raj Bhawan, who informed me of it. Members of my family became frightened by these calls. Later, I received further information from the telephone operator that the concerned ADC was about to start for my flat with an ulterior motive of causing harm to me. I immediately contacted the Home Secretary over the phone, apprised him of the situation, and sought his instant help. I also told him that I was unable to contact my secretary. The Home Secretary told me that my secretary was at his place, he would appraise the latter of the developments I had reported and take proper action. As for ourselves, we took refuge in our opposite flat in which lived Mr. Nibir Bandopathyay, chief engineer, with his family. A little later, we heard the sound of repeated pounding on the door of our flat. I saw through the eye hole of the door of the flat where we had taken refuge that the Navy ADC was standing in front of our flat kicking on the door. He had an associate with him, a Raj Bhawan driver, who was calling me aloud announcing his name as Sunkar. The ADC could not kick open the door, and we heard him asking his associate to break open it, which the associate refused to do. He had no qualms even to break open the door. The activity of the ADC at that instance was nothing better than that of a ruffian. Some time later, the military police arrived, possibly at the instance of the Home Secretary, whom I had apprised earlier of ADC's move. Then came 3 state police personnel led by an official from the local PS. The military police took away the Navy ADC. The officer from the local PS recorded my statement in the presence of the occupants of the flat, where we had taken shelter, and left. No action against the delinquent though reported at all levels. The Secretary to the Governor had the full knowledge of ADC's transgressing to my residence, followed by intimidation and threat of the previous night. He had also been aware of the possibility of further attack by the ADC in the context of the latter's threat of the previous night. Yet, he did nothing to restrain the ADC concerned from his contemptuous and illegal act. He instead made himself unavailable by taking shelter in the Home Secretary's place to avoid being involved in the matter if the situation took an ugly turn. It is also significant that he did not, as my immediate superior, consider it necessary to contact me even once during the entire day of January 23. It would not be wrong to make a conjecture to the effect that the Secretary had his blessings on whatever was happening. It is a classic example of not only inaction and shirking of responsibility but also of the covert support of a senior IAS officer to a criminal act. On January 25, I officially informed the Secretary to the Governor of the latter incident of the January 23 by a due letter asking for action in the light of my earlier letter and the instant one. Copies of these letters were again forwarded to the Home Secretary and the Chief Secretary to the Government of West Bengal. If my memory fails me not, the matter was also brought to the notice of the Secretary in the Ministry of Defence, Government of India after the Navy ADC repeated the criminal act of January 22, 1992. The record of that communication has unfortunately got lost. I had also written to the officer in charge of Ellora PS on the 29th of January 1992 under registered post asking him to take action against the accused on the basis of my statement recorded by the police officer at the place of occurrence on the night of January 23, 1992 and had forwarded him a synopsis of the points I had mentioned while giving that statement. I had requested him, the OC of the PS, to include the synopsis as a part of the FIR. But my letter of intimation was not treated as FIR, and no case was started. The Governor, late Professor S. Nurul Hassan, had been away at the time of the incident. After he returned, I met him and reported the incident requesting action against the delinquent officer. The Governor had listened to me but had refrained from making any observation. I was stunned at the total silence of the Governor without an iota of condemnation for ADC's act or a word of solace for me. He did not spend a single word to indicate that he was displeased and would look into the matter. I had expected, he, as the head of the state and a learned man, would have the virtue of imparting justice, but that expectation was belied. Before I had left, I had informed him that I had to go on leave. It was not possible to work in such an environment. I was on leave when I met the Governor. It may not be out of place to mention here that the same Governor had once expressed his displeasure about me to his secretary in my presence, saying, quote, "This man will always show you the rules," unquote. I am not aware of any action from any end. The entire matter was hushed up at all quarters. Even an inquiry, as I had demanded, was not conducted at any level of civil administration, otherwise, I, being the aggrieved party, must have known about it. It is thus clear that those in power wanted this grievous matter to die a silent death. I had demanded an impartial inquiry on the conduct of the Navy ADC, who had criminally trespassed on my residence, in my communications to various authorities. I don't, however, know if the Naval Headquarters had taken any action against the ADC. It was likely that the administrative authority of the concerned Navy ADC, in his parent department, would have got some kind of report from the military police, who had escorted the ADC out from the precinct of my flat on the night of the 23rd of January. My conclusion and observation of inaction by the authorities. In conclusion, I can only say that those at the helm of affairs in state administration and in Raj Bhawan at that time lacked the grit to proceed against as junior a defense service officer as of the rank of lieutenant, be it under political compulsion, or otherwise. They did not only not take any action against the delinquent officer, but also, as was obvious, exercised authority to stall all actions against my FIR to the OC Ellora, sent through registered post. The Home Secretary had told the press that no FIR had been lodged. It was despite my statement recorded by the police at the place of occurrence on the night of the incident of January 23, 1992, and my letter to the OC of the Ellora PS, to treat that statement as the FIR. The administration, too, did not cause any inquiry into the matter, even though I had asked for it. The intention to save some senior officers from being exposed for their role in the happenings might have acted against holding an independent inquiry. We had the following officers running the state and the Raj Bhawan at that time. 1. N. Krishnamurthy IAS, Chief Secretary, since deceased. 2. Manish Gupta, an ex-Army IAS, Home Secretary, since retired, and then joined Trinamool Congress Party, becoming a minister for one term and later an MP representing the same party. 3. Rajiv Srivastava, IAS, Secretary to the Governor. Since retired. Don't know his present occupation. Response to media declined by me. I downplayed the happenings. Despite pestering by the reporters, I refused to give an interview to the press, considering the sensitivity of the matter and the prestige of Raj Bhawan. The news, however, appeared later in the Statesman, Janas Atta, and Bartaman on different dates, each carrying a version of its own. As already stated, the police from the local PS had come on the 23rd of January 1992 and had recorded my statement. That was all they did on their part. Finding that the state authorities had hushed up the matter, I regretted that I had made a mistake in not bringing up the incidents from my end through the media, which had approached me for details. Why I could not seek legal redress. As for myself, I could not seek legal redress in an appropriate court of law as I did not have adequate resources in man and money. Besides, those in the corridor of power, who had been trying to hush up the matter, would not have taken it kindly and most certainly would have created serious troubles in my way of life. With my family solely depending on me, I could not take the risk. My leave and departure. My family members were scared and would not allow me to go to the office until the matter was settled. I went on leave from January 24, 1992, after the second incident on January 23. Within a week, I received orders of my transfer, which had been under consideration of the government since earlier to these incidents. I joined as Deputy Secretary to the government in the Department of Health and Family Welfare on February 1, 1992, on the expiry of my leave. I had spent 1 year and 2 months in the Health and Family Welfare Department. It is here I had got, for the first time, my order of promotion to IAS, which I had to decline due to reasons I have explained later in the next part of my story. One of the major decisions taken during my tenure in this department was introducing charges for radio imaging and similar services in the government hospitals. The OPD tickets in the government hospitals, too, were priced at 0.50 Indian rupees at that time. It was the first time in the history of the healthcare system of the state government had introduced such charges. The matter was dealt with in the medical service branch, which I used to look after as the Deputy Secretary. On April 1, 1994, I assumed the charge of the Deputy Secretary, Urban Development Department, on transfer from the Health and Family Welfare Department. I moved out from here on October 16, 1995, on promotion to IAS for the third time. There ended my career in the WBCS. I thought I would be able to complete the story of my life in 2 parts. But this part is already too voluminous, and there is still much to say. I am thus constrained to make the third part of my life story to tell about my service in the IAS and allied matters, including the difficulties and pressures I had to face on the way. Thanks for your patience in going through this part of my story.